Welcome, wrestling fans, to the Pro Wrestle Machine. Whether you're tuning in from the Great American Bash or halfway around the world, we've got a jam-packed episode for you. Get ready to dive into wrestling's rich history, packed with insights, opinions, and a few surprises. And remember, you can skip to your favorite moments with our chapter markers. Let's jump right into it. January 10, 2000 Observer Newsletter. Njpw Tokyo Dome 2000 Review. A look back at 1999 revenue. By Dave Meltzer. The mixed promotional angle, the very thing that New Japan has specialized in for nearly 3 decades, looks back in the forefront as representatives from WCW, J.J. Dillon and Paul Orndorff, and Ring's Akira Maeda, along with Nobuhiko Takada, all met with New Japan management in conjunction with the company's biggest show of the year, January 4th at the Tokyo Dome. The 5-hour show, billed as Tokyo Dome 2000, which drew a sellout 63,500 fans, good for the number 15 spot on the all-time list. No gate was announced, but we're told people who usually get comp tickets weren't given them, so it wasn't seriously papered, was said to have been a big success, and already set up several angles for Dome shows planned for both April and October. As in past years, the January 4th date was able to sell out based on annual tradition, as there was no match with huge ticket-selling impact on the show, with a main event where Kensuke Sasaki was crowned IWGP Heavyweight Champion, pinning Genichiro Tenryu. Maeda, Takada and Atsushi Onita were all advertised to be part of the show, the former two because of the retirement of Kazuo Yamazaki, which both had long histories working with dating back to the early 80s. Onita never appeared at the show before the crowd, but did an angle outside the building where he challenged Riki Choshu, who also never appeared before the crowd during the show, to an empty arena match after the show was over and the crowd left. Finally, after 10 minutes, a New Japan official came out and said that it wasn't going to happen, but it is still a match they are building for one of the Dome shows later in the year. Another match strongly hinted at was Sasaki to defend the title against Takada on the April Dome show. This was originally scheduled for August 28 at Jingu Baseball Stadium in Tokyo, but Takada bowed out and New Japan was so upset at the way he backed out that it was said the two sides would never work together. After the show, Takada was asked about the proposed match with Sasaki, and he said it was 50-50 whether it would take place, and he'd wrestle this year on big shows for New Japan. In addition, Maeda, Antonio Inoki and Tatsumi Fujinami had a meeting where Maeda proposed a New Japan vs. Rings program. 2 other Rings native stars, its world champion Kiyoshi Tamura and also Hiromitsu Kanehara. He worked with New Japan in 1995 and 96 in the New Japan vs. UWFI feud, were also at the show as part of the Yamazaki retirement ceremony. The WCW influence at the show were Dillon and Orndorff as management and wrestlers Chris Benoit, Rick Steiner, and Randy Savage. Benoit wrestling as Wild Pegasus, with Dillon and Orndorff at ringside with Brad Rheingans watching, lost to Hiroyoshi Tenzan in one of the better matches on the show, but later they were building up a match with Pegasus and Jushin Liger challenging IWGP Junior Tag Champs Tatsuhito Takaiwa and Shinjiro Otani for later in the year. At one point, Benoit had tried to propose a match on this show where he would challenge Bret Hart for the WCW title, but WCW turned down the suggestion. Steiner pinned Savage in what was reported as the worst match on the show, although they did throw in an American comedy spot involving TV announcer and former wrestler Masa Saito. A video of Bill Goldberg, showing a tape of him elbowing the car window from Salisbury, Maryland, and doing an interview where he showed his 40 stitches and apologized for not being at the show but said that he would wrestle for New Japan later in the year. 1. Shinjiro Otani and Tatsuhito Takaiwa retained the IWGP Junior Tag titles, beating Minoru Tanaka and Kendo Kashin Tokumitsu Ishizawa in 1309 when Takaiwa pinned Kashin. Kashin had Takaiwa in a triangle choke armbar combination when Takaiwa powered the move into a Death Valley driver, hit his triple bomb and finished with a form of a pile driver for the pin. This was said to be a really good opener. 2. Shiro Koshinaka pinned Satoshi Kojima in 10-17 after a powerbomb. The result is something of a surprise since Kojima's career is on the ascent as one of the company's few heavyweights with main event potential. The match was also said to be a major disappointment in that it was only fair at best from someone who really needed a strong performance on the company's traditional biggest show of the year. 3. Hiroyoshi Tenzan, Kim Killchoi, pinned Pegasus, Chris Benoit, in 10:55 in what was said to have been a really good match. It was billed as a battle of the diving headbutts and Tenzan scored the pin using that move. 4. In a really weird match, Jushin Liger, Keiichi Yamada, retained the IWGP Junior title, pinning Koji Kanemoto in only 3:56. There is clearly a story to all this, probably some sort of a working shoot. Liger came out fast using his palms and supposedly knocked Kanemoto out with a blow. With Kanemoto knocked out, Liger went with a Liger bomb, a new form of a brainbuster which started out like a Northern Lights suplex for the pin. Kanemoto went out on a stretcher, and even backstage they gave the impression he'd been knocked out. The short match is very rare for a junior heavyweight title match, or for that matter any title match in New Japan, and the last time there was a short match like that was in the 1996 J-Crown tournament where Ultimo Dragon pinned Liger, and a few days later it came out the reason for the short match was because Liger had a brain tumor. Kanemoto probably was injured going into the match, which is why it was kept short, and they did that angle to explain an injury because they went out so fast and it was so exciting early according to reports that it seemed they were going short from the start. The initial report we got was that this was considered by reporters as the best match on the show. 5. Manabu Nakanishi beat Kenzo Suzuki in 6:41 using the torture rack. Suzuki is a former college rugby star that Seiji Sakaguchi is trying to push as a future major star. The match told the story that Suzuki was strong, with him mainly using spears, but unskilled as pro wrestling so fans can see him develop before their eyes. Since it was Suzuki's pro debut, this wasn't a good match, but it was said to have accomplished what it was supposed to have, and that is have Suzuki make an impact and lose. 6. Yuji Nagata pinned Kazuo Yamazaki after 2 back suplexes in 6:44 in Yamazaki's retirement match. The match was said to have been good for what it was, since Yamazaki clearly isn't in good condition due to injuries that caused him to retire at the age of 37. After the match they held a retirement ceremony with Fujinami, Sakaguchi, Maeda, Takada, Tamura and Kane in the ring. It was surprising that Choshu wasn't part of the ceremony. 7. Kimo Leopoldo beat Kazuyuki Fujita via DQ in 4:01 when Fujita delivered a knee to the groin and the match was stopped. As you can imagine, fans hated this finish and it ruined the match. 8. Scott Norton pinned Don Fry in 8:50 after a power bomb. A lot of this match was brawling outside the ring. The match was said to have been really sloppy but had a lot of heat. 9. Rick Steiner, Robert Reach Steiner, pinned Randy Savage, Randy Poffo, in 11:08 after a bulldog off the top rope. It was said that Savage made a really great ring introduction, but that was the highlight of the match. Fans were said to have been shocked at just how far Steiner had declined as far as ability and speed in the ring since he was formerly a regular with this promotion, and it was described as like watching 2 old men in the ring. Savage tried to heat the crowd by constantly making motions challenging TV announcer Masa Saito. This built to a comedy spot where Steiner held Savage in a full Nelson and Saito hit him. 10. Shinya Hashimoto and Takayuki Iizuka beat Naoya Ogawa and Kazunari Murakami after 2 matches in a very heated but weird situation. It started with Murakami going crazy attacking Iizuka, taking him down and punching him from the mount and kicking him in the head, knocking Iizuka out. Hashimoto then attacked Murakami and Ogawa attacked Hashimoto, and it was one of those bench-clearing brawls where everyone ran in, and at 2:24 it was declared a no contest. As you can imagine, the crowd was thrilled by what they thought was the ending. Antonio Inoki got in the ring and yelled at all the participants for fighting dirty and said the people wanted to see a clean wrestling match. Can you imagine the reaction that would have gotten in the States? Iizuka then woke up and didn't even know he'd been knocked out or that the match ended. Iizuka in the restarted match won using a choke on Murakami in 8:59 when the referee stopped the match. Match was said to have not been a great technical match but had a lot of heat. After the match, Hashimoto challenged Ogawa to a singles match, and on television, Fujinami said they would try and put it together for April at the Tokyo Dome. 11. Masahiro Chono beat Keiji Muto in 25 minutes with a cross STF. Match was said to have been a great psychological match, mainly with Muto using figure 4s and Chono using STFs. Muto still delivered his moonsault on his bad knees. Chono used his Yakuza kick and a new form of the STF called a cross STF, using a different leg lock to set the move up for the submission. 12. Sasaki pinned Tenryu, Genichiro Shimade, to capture the IWGP heavyweight title in 14:43 after 2 Northern Light bombs. This was mainly exchanges of punches back and forth but also considered to be a good match. In hindsight, there's little question from a media standpoint that 1999 was the biggest year ever for pro wrestling. In a few weeks, we'll review whether it really was or wasn't the biggest by any standards. By many standards, it clearly was not, and certainly by the end of the year overall attendance among the big 3 promotions were down, WWF holding steady, WCW in a big decline and ECW declining until late in the year, although because ticket prices were raised across the board from all 3 companies, they did take in more revenue at the ticket window from fewer fans, and the Monday night ratings overall were below last year's levels when it gave the NFL what at the time was considered surprising competition. Again, That decline is that WCW's losses were generally greater than WWF's gains. In pay-per-view, the WWF was remaining at about the same level as last year even with far more viewers, while WCW hit a free fall and whatever increase in buys ECW gained was more attributed to opening up the Canadian market than increasing in buy rate itself, but it was easily the biggest revenue year in the history of the industry. Largely more revenue streams, from the internet to video games to greater television ad revenue than ever before. But in looking at pro wrestling on a worldwide basis, there is only one definite as we start the new century. The WWF is really big. And it's going to get bigger. It would be a shock due to the changing landscape of this week that the ratings don't make another big jump, which should lead to even more media publicity, more ad revenue, etc. Laying out 2000 is pretty easy. They've got a built-in storyline for WrestleMania which, whether it be at Mania or at some other point next year, should culminate in The Rock winning the title and being the official, as opposed to unofficial at this point, standard bearer and biggest star in the industry. If all goes according to plan, they have the Mick Foley stepping down story coming up, and long before things would even start to get stagnant, a hopeful return of Steve Austin and an eventual heel turn leading to a feud with Rock which should generate huge business. Hunter Hearst Helmsley has come into his own as a big show headliner and fans are starting to recognize a lot of the undercard wrestlers as growing superstars. The only thing that seems on the surface that would affect any of this are a rash of injuries at the same time, which is possible but the WWF has survived without missing a beat with Austin out for much of the last several months, or a scandal, which history shows us that WWF usually walks headlong into. Perhaps learning from the past and having to answer to the crazy whims of the stock market will lead to a different approach the next time. Something like what happened in recent weeks with the sponsors, a situation that could have been easily quelled by a responsive as opposed to a combative response to criticism, without the resulting bad publicity and severe stock price drop during the week of a super quarterly report, can be learned from in the future. The popularity of WWF with its public will survive anything, because the odds are great that 2000 won't bring two incidents of the like of the Owen Hart death and the Darren Drozdov paralysis, neither of which had any effects on the popularity of the product, although the Hart death probably wouldn't have played well with the stock either if the company had already gone public. The WWF toned down SmackDown with at this point zero effect on the ratings. The January 3rd Raw was also notably toned down, although every time you write toned down and WWF together, they try something shocking the next week. But aside from WWF, no major company in the US and Japan enters 2000 with a great year looking in the offing. New Japan, which actually did better attendance overall in 1999 than it had in several years, was showing signs of being stagnant particularly as the year went on. Both of the major Japanese companies show signs of trouble for the same thing that plagues WCW today, aging, or in the case of Japan, not necessarily aging but stars breaking down physically without replacements being groomed well. Keiji Muto was voted MVP in virtually every Japanese poll, for carrying New Japan during a year that Shinya Hashimoto was almost a non-factor and his career took a major plunge, and Masahiro Chono was never close to 100% in the ring. But Muto's knees are shot, which became more evident in the summer and fall, and at 37, he may be wrestling on borrowed time. Looking back, it's hard to see what the company would have been without him this year. The plan from the G1 tournament to make Manabu Nakanishi into a major player was probably a mistake from the start, even though it was probably handled from a booking standpoint fairly well, at least as it pertains to the initial push at G1. There's nothing new to say about All Japan that hasn't been said in years, other than they're all 1 year older and more beaten up, and they still had the best wrestling matches in the world. Fact is, even with Vader being added to the mix, crowds were down, although it was a good year as far as TV ratings went. Still, it is clear that outside of the ring that Mitsuharu Misawa is nowhere close to Shohei Baba, and there was never less interest in the year-end tag team tournament. The injuries piled up as Misawa and Kenta Kobashi both worked most of the year with injuries that should have sidelined them. Toshiaki Kawada missed most of the year with a pair of serious injuries, a broken arm followed by a devastating eye injury. A serious injury to Misawa, which could happen at any time, would be devastating at this point. Akira Taue's work declined. The only young wrestler who looks to be a major factor is Jun Akiyama. The No Fear heel group is terrible in the ring in a company built on work rate, a fact that sometimes is hidden because the people they work with are so good. The era of shoot-style pro wrestling seems to be dead. With the plethora of real shooting of once super popular UWS style, that did massive business in the late 80s and early 90s, is just about gone, particularly with rings seeming going more and more toward being a shoot promotion, as only the small Battle Arts group still does the concept. Since fans have seen real shooting, the idea of worked shoots, which actually was an exciting and successful form of pro wrestling in its day, seems to have run its course. The problem is, it is very difficult over the long haul to keep a shooting promotion going strong. The drawing cards lose their ability in the ring due to injuries long before they peak as draws. Usually once they start drawing, they get overbooked and physically burn out. Promoting of shooting successfully is more like boxing in the US than pro wrestling, in that if you can build to a dream match, you can make good money. But only a few people are truly draws. Rings had its TV money cut back on, and this all-shoot tournament may be very interesting to the small martial arts audience, but Rings is nowhere near the level of popularity it was when it was really pro wrestling. Pancrase is left with nothing but the hardcores. Its draws are physically finished, and its younger guys who are its best fighters aren't big enough to be the dreaded toughest man that has drawing power, nor do they have general public names. The biggest success as a company by the end of the year was DSE, but that was largely through using pro wrestlers like Naoya Ogawa and Nobuhiko Takada as draws before finally getting Kazushi Sakuraba over with his win over Royler Gracie. But that company seems to be looking, after booking 2 Tokyo Domes early next year for shoot shows, at WWF as its future partner. The 3 big concepts of the 90s introduced in Japan, actually all in 1993, were Pancrase, with the idea of it being pro wrestling as legitimate sports, and Michinoku Pro as a regionalized Japanese lucha libre company, which has since split into a second group called Osaka Pro, and with the initial success of UFC in the United States, it led to greater interest in Valley Tudo-type promotions in Japan, of which DSE became the most prominent. The year 1993, in hindsight, from a concept standard, was the most important in the business because it was also the start of ECW and UFC in the United States. While ECW did pioneer many aspects of wrestling that both WWF and WCW took, much of its backbone can be traced to FMW in Japan, which Atsushi Onita learned from wrestling early in his career in both Puerto Rico and Memphis. While the real matches were far more successful from a business standpoint on pay-per-view than the pure hardcore style initially, due to political problems and the inherent problems of booking shooting long-term, in both Japan and even more so the United States, the hardcore style probably goes into the new decade with more legs and momentum than the actual real style. ECW had an interesting 1999 to follow. From the early part of the year, where the company was in terrible financial shape, checks were bouncing left and right and morale was at an all-time low. TNN probably really did save the company. While ECW's numbers on TNN are its highest-rated shows on its heavily pushed Friday nights, unless you ignore everything that took place before the show debuted, in particular, David Hall's projection of a 2.0 rating for the season and ads being sold on a 1.9 average for the year, the ratings started at a very disappointing level. They've grown very slowly after a very rocky first 6 weeks when the concept of providing great long matches built around Rob Van Dam and Jerry Lynn was changed to building around the temporary fix of Tammy Sytch and cat fights. Sytch didn't last, but the sex was enough to build the ratings from a low of 0.7 to a steady 1.1, and Inside the Ring, in recent weeks with the show is easily best in ring and most heated product on the US scene. And then we come to WCW. There is no indication that things look bright for the company. Privately within the company there has been an admission that the company is actually closer in popularity now to ECW than it is to WWF. Obviously there is some feeling that the hiring of Vince Russo was a big mistake. While those who didn't want him in the first place are arguing his concepts aren't working and they need to cut their losses, there is clearly an opinion that getting rid of him after 2 or 3 months wouldn't be fair. The company is still doing what would be considered good ratings for most shows on cable. But if a flagship, or for that matter, any show on a network show aside from a show changed from a plum time slot and put into a weaker slot, would have had its ratings plunge the way Nitro and Thunder did over the past year, the reaction would be far more of a panic. Probably the most important story to watch next year will be the goings-on within the company, and if this concept fails to catch on, and who knows, maybe it will, what concept and what person will be put in the position next. After being in wrestling for nearly 12 years and only being truly successful for about 3 of them, questions have to be asked about what the limitations are of having a wrestling company without a strong autonomous wrestling person at the helm. The fact is, certain concepts that look bad today, such as the guaranteed money contracts, seemed to work well enough just 2 years ago when the company was booming, and have worked in Japan for decades when the work rate by and large of the wrestlers was top-notch. But clearly, there is the incentive to progress through good wrestling and thus make a better contract by working harder. That is clearly missing in WCW, which for all the talk of having the best talent in the world, hardly puts on the best product in or out of the ring. Even during its bad periods of the past, WCW always had some strengths, admittedly that it failed to capitalize on, but they had them, and that can't be said about today. The only thing WCW is strong in is that it has great exposure of a mediocre to bad product, and just through that exposure can put some numbers on the board. Far more than the television ratings not moving or even the house show decline. The Starrcade show, the company's supposed flagship card of the year featuring its biggest star in his quest to get the world title, and its total failure, is a sign that hopefully won't be ignored or given another round of lame excuses. But this is still the wrestling company with the strongest financial backing. WCW should be the #1 wrestling organization in the world. And 18 months ago, it was. It's no secret why it isn't. How it can get there again is a lot more of a mystery. In the December 27th ratings, which will be the final ratings under these conditions, the actual final tally saw Raw do a 5.85 rating, 5.55 first hour, 6.12 seconds hour, and a 9.1 share to Nitro's 2.86 rating, 3.68 first hour, 2.54 seconds hour, 2.44 third hour, and a 4.5 share. Over the head-to-head 2 hours and 6 minutes, Raw's 5.85 destroyed Nitro's 2.32, including doubling it in every quarter and tripling it in 2 quarters and the competitive overrun period. Once again, the reason each of the Nitro head-to-head hours was better than its average against Raw is that with Nitro going 6 minutes longer than Raw, the unopposed 6 minutes raised the third hour average from a 2.22 to a 2.44. For an overall rating, it was not the second lowest of the last few years as the Onites indicated, but actually the third lowest, behind Nash's last week and the show 2 weeks earlier. For head-to-head rating against Raw, it was the second lowest of the last few years. NFL Monday Night Football did a 14.43 rating and a 25.0 share in opposition to the 2 wrestling shows. The combined audience watching Monday Night Pro Wrestling was 9.5 million. Raw peaked with a 6.65 rating for the Big Show vs. Triple H title match, followed by a 6.42 rating for The Rock vs. Mankind Pink Slip-on-a-Pole match. The inexplicable WCW high point was a 2.57 rating for the Vampiro and Evan Karagi's vs. David Flair and Crowbar match. For whatever reason, David Flair of late has been, besides Bill Goldberg, WCW's biggest ratings draw. The WWF low point was a 5.37 for the Four Corners match, Dudley's, Christian, and Edge, Acolytes and Godfather and Brown with Posse interfering, and the Angle vs. Headbangers handicap match. The WCW apparent low point was 1.94 for the Bagwell and Canyon vs. Vito and Disco match. Because it went 6 minutes unopposed, the WCW main event of Nash vs. Wall and Sid Vicious did a 3.01 rating, but it would appear, and without minute by minutes this may not be accurate, that over the head-to-head period while competing against the WWF main event that the number was in the 1.6 to 1.7 range, which would make it among the lowest rated main events in Nitro history, which actually should be no surprise given Wall's participation. The fact it was going against a possible title change, people at least believed it was possible, on the other show, and that it was a bad match on paper finishing up a terrible show. WCW's best part of the show, the Jarrett vs. Kidman match, unfortunately for them, drew only a 2.08 rating, being more than tripled by the Rock vs. Mankind match. WWF's Strong in Ring match with X-Pac vs. Jeff Hardy drew a healthy 6.00 rating, destroying Nitro's 2.30 for Ron and Don Harris vs. Finlay and Meng. WCW's title match of Hart vs. Flynn did a 2.46, losing to a 5.48 for Chyna vs. Crash Holly. The December 30th WCW Best of Nitro special on TNT drew a 1.66 rating and a 2.7 share, which did make it the highest rated show of the day on the station, but nothing special when it came to primetime numbers. In other weekend numbers, Livewire did a 1.6, Superstars did a 1.5, and Sunday Night Heat did an unusually low 2.93 rating, although all these numbers being down could be partially attributed to the holiday weekend. WCW Saturday Night was preempted since it fell on Christmas. We didn't get any details on the TNN ratings on Christmas and New Year's Eve other than ECW did a 1.1 and 0.9 respectively for both very strong shows. By the standards of ECW on TNN, even though they are in the range the company usually does, both should be considered a good marks because virtually all TV shows were running reruns on Christmas, and because New Year's the competition with all the hour-by-hour New Year's across the globe shows and people not watching TV on that night should have held down ratings. Because of the New Year's holiday, we don't have any ratings info besides ECW for this week other than on January 3rd in the overnight ratings of the top 40 metered markets, Raw did a 6.5 and Nitro did a 3.4. This naturally was cause for celebration within WCW, even though anyone who reads this publication knows it isn't really the increase that it sounds like it is. Japanese Television Rundown. December 18, New Japan. 1. Minoru Tanaka and Dr. Wagner Jr. and Kendo Kashin beat Shinjiro Otani and Koji Kanemoto and Tatsuhito Takaiwa in 11:49. The last 6 minutes aired. It was typical real good stuff but didn't have the heat. It did have the feeling of sameness as with every New Japan Junior match, which may explain why the heat wasn't that good, but these guys are all really good and the finish was hot. Ending with Tanaka made Takaiwa submit to an armbar. 3.5 stars. 2. Genichiro Tenryu and Shiro Koshinaka beat Tatsumi Fujinami and Takashi Iizuka in 12:28. The last 7 minutes aired. It was a dead match early, but picked up with a good spot where Iizuka got a heel hook on Tenryu right after Tenryu power bombed him. Iizuka also got a flying armbar on. It picked up to a decent match ending when Tenryu pinned Fujinami after a lariat. 2.5 stars. 3. Manabu Nakanishi and Yuji Nagata retained the IWGP tag titles, beating Satoshi Kojima and Hiroyoshi Tenzan in 1846. Most of the match aired. There was nothing wrong with it, but again it was missing crowd heat. Nakanishi and Nagata teased a split where they argued. Nakanishi attacked Nagata and put him in the rack, but then threw him onto Tenzan. Kojima and Tenzan did a new spot where Kojima climbed to the middle rope and Tenzan to the top, and Kojima came off with an elbow while Tenzan then came off with a headbutt. Match started building and Kojima got a good near fall with a lariat on Nagata, then hit 2 more lariats before Nagata blocked it and delivered a back suplex for the pin. 2.5 stars. Mexico. Pimpinela Escarlata, who has been a huge draw in Nuevo Laredo for the past few years, finally made his EMLL debut on January 1, making him the first exotico, transvestite, character the promotion has used since Sergio El Hermoso and El Bello Greco as a tag team in the 80s. He is wrestling simply under the name Pimpinela. The only thing noted about his debut in the Mexico City papers was that he looked much heavier than when he wrestled for the UWA in Mexico City many years ago. On the January 1 show at Arena Coliseo, in a battle of rudos, Pierroth Jr. and Villano Tercero and Dr. Wagner Jr. beat Los Hermanos Dinamita via DQ when Mascara Ano 2000 fouled Pierroth in the third fall. The two argued and agreed to a hair versus hair match on March 10, which, as coincidence would have it, is both men's 42nd birthday. Pierroth has been telling people for a while that he was going to retire on that day. January 6 in Tijuana as Negro Casas and Tinieblas Jr. and Felino versus Damien and Halloween and Rey Mysterio Sr. as the main event, plus the biggest push on the show is the debut of the Pokemon wrestlers in the semifinal. I guess somebody was going to do that at some point. Antonio Pena in an interview in Ovaciones said he was planning on doing the 6-sided cage match and a match in water early this year, and also talked about later in the year doing tours of California, Colombia and Argentina, and also said he wanted to bring more foreign stars in this year. Local Guadalajara star Macabre won a hair versus hair match over Karloff Lagarde Jr. on December 26 in that city. Toryuman wrestlers Yasushi Kanda and Susumu Mochizuki won a tournament on January 2 in Naucalpan to become the first IWRG Tag Team Champions, probably as belts to start defending in Japan, beating Fantasy and Black Dragon in the finals of an 8-man tournament. Ringo Mendoza retained the CMLL middleweight title, beating Zumbito on January 2 in Mexico City at Arena Coliseo. Juan Alanis, a promoter in several small arenas in the Mexico City area, died on January 2 of a heart attack at the age of 69. He was most known for holding an annual Rookies tournament. The EMLL TV main event for January 7 at Arena Coliseo is Atlantis and Brazo de Plata and Rayo de Jalisco Jr. versus Villano Tercero and Pierroth Jr. and Fuerza Guerrera. Cobarde is the new Mexican national heavyweight champion. We don't exactly have details that make sense since the champion last week was Latin Lover, who was scheduled to defend the title on December 25 in Toluca against El Hijo del Solitario. They had a match on that date in that city where Cobarde beat Solitario and was declared the new champion. Lover had beaten Cobarde for that title 2 months ago. Lady Apache beat La Diabolica on December 26 in Naucalpan to retain the CMLL women's title. The son of retired wrestler Hombre Bala, a brother of Pirata Morgan, debuted on December 26 at a small show in Mexico City as Hombre Bala Jr., and his father is expected to come out of retirement for at least a few shows to work a tag team with him. Televisa, which is the largest network in Mexico, on January 2 ran a 1984 television special called Contrapunto, Counterpunch, with a debate on whether lucha libre should be considered sport or show, but what was unique about the debate was who was involved. Arguing it was a sport were Blue Demon, Mocho Cota, a top heel at the time, and one reporter. arguing it was not a sport where El Santo, original, who actually died 1 month later, Wolf Ruvinskis and another reporter. This was the famous television show where Santo, who apparently knew he was dying, took his mask off on television. All Japan. Naohito Morishita of Dream Stage Entertainment had a meeting with Mitsuharu Misawa on December 24, with Morishita trying to get either Mike Barton or Gary Albright into the January 30 Tokyo Dome shoot tournament. Misawa talked about wanting to do a Tokyo Dome show this year on May 1st and get Kazushi Sakuraba to wrestle on the show. Steve Williams returned and won the season opening, and traditionally horrible beyond belief, Battle Royal on the January 2nd show at Korakuen Hall by pinning Jun Izumida with the backdrop driver in 9-10. Earlier in the show, Williams and George Hines teamed to beat All-Asian Tag Champs Masao Inoue and Tamon Honda in a non-title match in 14:29, when Williams used the same move on Inoue. They were trying to push Williams to be back in his old headliner position, but the reports we got is that he didn't look good. The first main event of the new year saw Mitsuharu Misawa and Yoshinari Ogawa and Masahito Kakihara beat Akira Taue and Johnny Smith and Tsuyoshi Kikuchi, which doesn't sound like much of a main event. Kentaro Shigawa won the annual Junior Heavyweight Battle Royal on January 3 at Korakuen Hall. Satoru Asako has joined with Yoshihiro Takayama and Takao Mori as the third member of the No Fear group. Both Vader and Johnny Ace were given a few days off early in the tour and arrive on January 6. December 5 TV show, which was the Tag Team Tournament Finals, drew a 4.0 rating. New Japan. December 4 TV show drew a 2.2 rating. Other Japan notes. Nikkei Sports this week announced its voting for the match of the decade, with the October 31, 1998 Mitsuharu Misawa vs. Kenta Kobashi match where Misawa pinned Kobashi in 43-29, getting 21.8% of the vote and winning. Giant Baba called this match the best wrestling match ever held, and it would have to be very high on any list for match of the decade, or for that matter very high on any list of greatest wrestling match ever held. The October 9, 1995 match from the Tokyo Dome where Keiji Muto pinned Nobuhiko Tada before 67,000 fans finished second with 18.2%. That was a really good match with incredible heat, but it was more the idea of them wrestling each other and it being the New Japan World Champion against the UWFI's biggest star and sort of world champion. Luthez had actually taken his belt back after a money dispute with UWFI, but to the fans it was generally considered two world champions from very different style promotions against each other, and was probably the most memorable match of the decade in Japan because of the hype and anticipation. The remainder of the top 10 were another Misawa vs. Kobashi match from January 20, 1997 and third. That match finished second in the Observer poll in one of the closest balloting in history, losing to the Steve Austin vs. Bret Hart WrestleMania match, and it was an awesome match, and with this year's Misawa vs. Kobashi match also a strong candidate. It would become unprecedented where the same two wrestlers had a top 2 or top 3 match of the year against each other 3 consecutive years, with 10.0%. Genichiro Tenryu vs. Riki Choshu from January 4, 1993 was fourth at 7.4%. Misawa vs. Vader from the Tokyo Dome on May 2, 1999 was fifth. Actually, their match where Vader won the title I thought was a better match than this one, at 7.2%. Muto vs. Tenryu from May 3, 1999 in Fukuoka was sixth. An excellent match, but there were better matches in the decade. At 6.2%, a Stan Hansen vs. Toshiaki Kawada match finished 7th. Don't know the date, but those two had a lot of classics early in the decade. At 4.9%, Atsushi Onita vs. Tarzan Goto on September 23, 1991, which I believe was the first ever explosive barbed wire match, finished 8th, which really was something at the time for a show headlined by Onita and Goto to draw 33,000 fans. At 3.8%, and Nobuhiko Takada vs. Tenryu from Jingu Stadium on September 11, 1996 was 9th. A very good match, but it was a big deal more because it was the first time these two ever wrestled in a singles match rather than it being one of the best in-ring matches of the decade. At 2.6, as would be expected, the category of shoot-style pro wrestling went into a pretty noticeable decline in 1999. Rings actually went up in average, but that's misleading, as in 1998 it ran 13 shows and averaged 5,665 fans per event, while in 1999 it ran 10 shows and averaged 6,105 on a per event average. Rings would have finished behind only WWF on a worldwide pro wrestling basis. However, that average is skewed by the Akira Maeda vs. Alexander Karelin match, and if you take that out of the picture, the per-show average is down to 4,890, which would put it behind New Japan and maybe put it behind WCW as well. Pancrase dropped from 15 shows averaging 3,585 per show to 14 shows averaging 2,954. Battlerts went from averaging 823 per show to 660, and as a whole the genre of shoot-style wrestling dropped 25.3% for the year, and that's with rings having a higher percentage of real matches than ever before and Pancrase being basically totally shoot all year. After losing her match on December 28 at Korakuen Hall to Linus Asuka in a TWF World Title vs. Mask match, Kuga, real name Miori Kamiya, took off her mask and announced her retirement. Kuga pulled off her mask to reveal a bloody face from chair shots. They announced her retirement match for January 10 at Korakuen Hall, which is the next JD show. Kamiya, 30, debuted with All Japan Women under her real name in 1986 and often teamed with Asia Kong as part of the Jungle Jacks years later, before her retirement under her real name in 1992. She returned when JD was formed in 1995 under a mask. The FMW vs. Big Japan feud started on the January 2 Big Japan show at Korakuen Hall, where Geto, Jado and Kentaro Kanemura from FMW showed up and issued challenges. On that show, Tomoaki Honma won the Big Japan Deathmatch title in a barbed wire board and barbed wire spike nail match over Ryuji Yamakawa, winning with a Frankensteiner onto the barbed wire board. All Japan Women opened 2000 with its first sellout in what seems like more years at Korakuen Hall as Tomoko Watanabe and Kumiko Makawa retained the WWA tag titles, beating Manami Toyota and Miho Wakizawa in February 3 falls. After the match, former champs Atsuko Mita and Mima Shimoda issued a challenge for a title match which will take place on AJW's first major show of the year on March 4 at Yokohama Bunka Gym. They came back the next afternoon with a second sellout for Manami Toyota, winning the WWA title from Yumiko Hata in 21:01 with the Japanese Ocean Cyclone Suplex. Toyota got a standing ovation at the finish. Hata is going to start training in Kyokushin Karate and have her first match under those rules in March. On the March 4 show, AJW is looking at Toyota doing an interpromotional title defense against either Eagle Sawai of LLPW or Linus Asuka of JD. Also on January 4, in the traditional evening show by LLPW took place. The tradition on January 4, which is sort of a wrestling day in Tokyo, is for All Japan Women to run noon at Korakuen Hall, New Japan to run the Tokyo Dome at 3 p.m. AJW in an unwritten rule ends its show by 2:45 p.m. because most of the people who attend the AJW show have Tokyo Dome tickets. The buildings are about 50 yards apart. And then LLPW does its 7 p.m. start back to the hall. On that show's main event, Rumi Kazama and Sawai and Carol Midori won the LLPW 6 women titles from Harley Saito and Norio Tatano and Keiko Aono. Also on January 4 in Osaka, in the biggest card ever put on by the Osaka Pro Wrestling promotion at the Namihaya Dome in Osaka before an announced sellout of 1,705, Super Delphin pinned Dick Togo in the main event. Here and there. The Rolling Stone magazine issue on pro wrestling was moved back 1 month because there is just so much to it. It's now scheduled for the March 2000 issue, which hits the newsstands in early February. The movie Beyond the Mat made the final 12 in contention for the Academy Award for Best Documentary. They'll have a runoff vote to narrow it down to the 5 nominees, which will be released on February 15, and the Academy Awards show itself is on March 26. The movie is tentatively set for major theatrical release in March, with the dates expected to be finalized this week. In the Los Angeles Times listing of the top movies of any kind in 1999, it garnered an honorable mention and got a similar mention in New Times. ESPN magazine in the January 10 issue, which should be on the stands right now, has a short item about producer Barry Blaustein and the creation of the movie. It noted that at his 40th birthday party about 5 years ago, Blaustein, who described himself as a closet wrestling fan, Dusty Rhodes, was flown in as a surprise by his wife. At that point he decided to make a movie about wrestlers. Now that the movie was such a big, at least artistic success, financially is still up in the air, but it probably will be. Rhodes is taking credit for giving Blaustein the idea for the movie. The issue also had a photo feature with real sports credentials for various pro wrestlers. Limited to The Rock played football at University of Miami, Randy Savage played minor league baseball, Bill Goldberg played for the Atlanta Falcons, Mark Henry was a weightlifter in the Olympics. Of course they didn't include Kurt Angle, who was a gold medalist in those same Olympics, and Kevin Nash played college basketball. As expected, Dennis Corraluzzo has left the NWA over a $3,000 financial dispute. As mentioned last week, the dispute is over a number of things, included money owed to Naoya Ogawa when he worked shows, along with disputes about merchandising and trans for the 51st anniversary show. Corluzzo's place on the NWA board of directors has been taken by Rick O'Brien of the NWA New York promotion, so the board now consists of Howard Brody as president and Bill Behrens as vice president, along with indie promoters David Baucom, Jim Miller and Ernie Todd, plus Antonio Inoki. Mike Chapman, who is the leading amateur wrestling historian in the United States, put out a list of the 10 greatest amateur wrestlers in American history. He listed Danny Hodge at number 9. He listed Hodge as the greatest college wrestler ever in any weight class, but those ranked above him were those who competed longer and won gold medals at the Olympic level. Dan Gable was listed at number 1 by a slight margin over John Smith, with Bruce Baumgartner third. Mark Schultz, who competed once in UFC, was 4th, while Brother David was 7th, and Henry Wittenberg, who beat Vern Gagne out at 191 pounds in the 1948 Olympic trials, was number 8. Gagne did not make the list, nor a listing of those under consideration for a top 10 spot. Kurt Angle, Kevin Jackson and Kenny Monday all made that second list. The third annual Brian Pillman Memorial Show, put on by Leigh Thatcher, his Heartland Wrestling promotion, will take place on May 25th in Cincinnati. Speaking of Thatcher, MSNBC is filming a piece starting on January 11th showing him training a student named BJ Whitmer, which will culminate in his first pro match, which takes place on January 22nd. The piece will air in February or March. Because Jim Cornette went on vacation, both the Memphis and Ohio Valley shows were produced more than a week ago and were best of 1999 type of shows. Jerry Lawler has gotten TV on Channel 30 in Memphis and will begin running opposition to Power Pro. This is really weird because the Randy Hales Memphis promotion had turned into largely just a WWF developmental territory, and it's strange Lawler would run opposition to that. Lawler is said to be working with Nashville promoter Burt Prentice on this new territory. The December 25th Orlando Sentinel had an article on Gordon Solie by David Whitley. Due to his surgery, Solie can no longer breathe through either his mouth or his nose, but Whitley wrote that Solie looks healthier than he did before. He has to breathe through a hole in the throat the size of a quarter. The article blames Solie's love for cigarettes for his predicament. The article called Solie the voice of several TV generations, saying, about Solie's voice, it never screamed, never hyped, never spoke down to an audience that probably deserved it. And it sure never chortled through a show featuring topless women wrestlers and profanity-spewing characters concocted by McMahon's twisted marketing. In a Detroit press poll as to the greatest Detroit sports figure of the 20th century, the Sheik's name was mentioned in a list of people who received at least one vote out of the 1,087 votes cast. Gordie Howe won easily with 48.5% of the vote, followed by Ty Cobb, Steve Yzerman, Al Kaline, Joe Louis, and Barry Sanders. The New York Times Magazine will be doing a story on either January 9th or January 16th concerning Bob Backlund and Jon Stewart running for the U.S. House of Representatives being pro wrestlers. They interviewed both men on January 4th for the piece. Jacques Rougeau's December 29th show in Montreal drew about 2,600 fans in the 3,000-seat Pierre Charbonneau Center, his biggest crowd to date. In the main event, Ron and Jimmy Garvin won the Johnny Rougeau tag team titles from Jacques and Raymond Rougeau. Also appearing on the show were King Kong Bundy, Kurgan, Earthquake John Tenta, Tito Santana, and Bushwhackers. They had a tag team match with Kurgan and Tenta against locals Richard Charlon and Serge Dumont, ending when Tenta turned on Kurgan to set up a feud between the two of them, and won't that be something? Reports have it that Jimmy Garvin looked so overweight he could have passed for Jake Roberts. AWA Superstars of Wrestling has announced that adult film star Jasmine St. Clair will appear at its first TV tapings on February 29th in Laughlin, Nevada in an evening gown match, and that Yokozuna will also appear. Independent Wrestling World announced Clash of the Nations 2000 for February 12th and February 13th in Hanover, Germany, with a tournament to declare a junior heavyweight champion with Bernard Van Damme, Belgium, Michael Kovac, Austria, Jason Cross, United Kingdom, Leon Martinez, Spain, Robbie Brookside, UK, Jody Fleisch, UK, plus an American and a German to be added. Another angle with pro wrestlers on Jerry Springer took place on December 29th with indie wrestlers Darren Wise and Jimmy Deo doing an angle where Wise was doing pornos with Deo's girlfriend behind her back. And Springer tries to claim his angles aren't angles and that they don't use actors playing roles. Chico Cortez, who wrestled from 1937 to 1969 mainly in Tennessee and Texas, passed away in his sleep on December 28th at his home in Jackson, Tennessee at the age of 77. According to Scott Teal's Whatever Happened To newsletter, Cortez, whose real name was Basil Salazar, often trained with Ray Steele and wrestled with both Lou Thez and Jim Londos. He also wrestled under the name Tojo Yamamoto Jr. in Alabama, and after retiring, continued to work for Nick Buelas and Roy Welch, working the photo stands at the matches. IPW St. Petersburg Slaughter on February 18 at Giannis Landing in St. Pete has a show which includes Abdullah the Butcher, Reckless Youth, Chad Collier, Marty Jannetty, Mike Enos, Cuban Assassin Don Montoya and area independent wrestlers. A correction regarding the behind-the-scenes antics at the head-to-head December 25 shows in Nashville with NWA Worldwide and Main Event Wrestling. The King Cobra who used to supply the ring for Main Event Wrestling is not Jimmy Kimball, who wrestled as King Cobra for years in Memphis. It is Freddie Bogues, who wrestled as King Cobra on some small indies in eastern Tennessee. Bogues was running his own shows and getting talent through Main Event Wrestling, and all the Mew talent no-showed his most recent show. He was actually the one who was mad who got the ball rolling and through Corey Williams, came up with the idea of screwing them on Christmas and working for Burt Prentice. However, since he worked a TV taping on Christmas morning for Prentice, the word reached Reno Riggins, who was able to get another ring in time for his show. Williams, Ashley Hudson and Big Bully Douglas from the Nashville area were the security guys at the January 3rd Nitro in Greenville, South Carolina that came out with Terry Funk. At the Roller Jam tapings, the word was out that TNN had renewed the show for a fourth season, being that the show debuted in January 1999. How they could be ready for a fourth season must be new math. The new plans are for 2 one-hour Roller Jam shows per week as opposed to the current 2 hours after ECW on Friday. 1 hour would air on Friday and the other hour would air another night of the week, although the hour Roller Jam is giving up is not being earmarked for an expansion of ECW. Among the changes were that each team came out to their own specific entrance music. The Enforcers came out on Harleys and had a biker gang planted in the audience to root for them. Ray Robles, a Mexican skater, now throws chili pepper in his opponent's faces. Sean Atkinson is hoisted in the air while in a cage. Heather Gunnan is changing her name and had implants put in and is now billed as Leather Gunnan and will be doing a lesbian storyline with Stacy Blitch, which started with Gunnan kissing her on the lips. The Nevada Hot Dice will be changing uniforms to wear more baggy pants. Jerry Seltzer was not only not the last set of tapings, but his name was never even spoken of. MMA. In another sign of the decline of UFC, referee John McCarthy has agreed to officiate and use his trademark "Let's Get It On" slogan, which he and Mills Lane have a combination trademark for both World Extreme Fighting on January 15 in Rome, Georgia, and for DSE on the January 30 Tokyo Dome show. This doesn't necessarily mean he won't officiate for UFC in the future, but that's now in Semaphore Entertainment Group's hands. Pancrase president Masami Ozaki said he was going to file a lawsuit against Akira Maeda in mid-January. This had been threatened before a few weeks back. For libel for when Maeda gave a speech on a college campus and said that Pancrase did worked matches. Ozaki has also claimed that Maeda was in negotiations with King of Pancrase champ Semi Schultz to get him to jump. The Ryan Gracie vs. Valid Ismail main event for the January 15th show is off, but the two have agreed to fight each other on the next WEF show. The new main event is UFC lightweight champ Pat Militic against Jose Pele Landy Johns, who is considered Brazil's best fighter in that weight class. Pride is now attempting to get some pro wrestlers into its January 30th Tokyo Dome tournament if Naoya Ogawa won't do the show. In the current ratings released by USA Wrestling, former UFC fighter Mike Van Arsdale was number 2 at 187 in freestyle, current DSE fighter Tom Erickson was number 4 at super heavyweight freestyle, Dennis Hall Shudo was number 1 in Greco-Roman at 128, Dan Henderson, still alive in the Rings tournament, was number 1 at 187 in Greco-Roman, and Randy Couture was number 2 in Greco-Roman at 214. ECW. TNN show was nearly as good as last week. The Tanaka vs. Awesome title change rematch from White Plains, New York wasn't as good a match as Nashville, but in some ways it came across better as a television match because Joey Styles did a great job with the announcing, and it was minus the commercial breakups that took away from the flow and drama of the first match. Officially, the show in White Plains drew 2,100 paid and 1,400 papered for a full house of 3,500. It appears most of the bigger numbers at TNN tapings are a result of houses being papered. The show opened with a Mikey Whipwreck interview anyway, all of 4 words before the Impact players came out and offered him a payoff for taking out Raven. Raven beat him in 4:48 with a DDT in a bad match. Problem was Whipwreck was on offense almost the entire match and mainly threw punches. His lefts are not exactly Arn Anderson caliber. Basically he took the worst thing in his repertoire and kept doing it. He did do an elbow drop outside, putting Raven through a table. Even though it is factually correct that Whipwreck was once ECW champion and once beat Steve Austin, I'm not sure advertising either of those deals makes ECW years later look very good. Anyway, For the finish, Raven blew his nose on a rag and shoved it in Whipwreck's face and gave him a DDT. The Impact players attacked him after and Dreamer made the save. They did a cut-in later where Raven was apparently in the ring and Francine told Dreamer to help Raven, and he refused and she was mad at him. Tajiri pinned Crazy and about 7:30 with a brainbuster. An excellent wrestling match. Not quite up to the level of matches these two did about a year ago, but still in the 3 3/4 stars range. Awesome beat Tanaka in 11:49. This was a lot sloppier than any match these two have ever had in ECW and maybe in Japan as well, but they did all sorts of big moves and the match had excellent heat, so it was another 3 3/4 stars match. Awesome did his running dive. Tanaka came back with a plancha. They did the same chair spot Tanaka does, getting hit 3 times and firing up. They do in every Tanaka match. Awesome came off the top with a chair, but Tanaka dropkicked the chair into his face. Tanaka came back hitting Awesome with a chair, using a chair elbow drop off the top and diamond dust for a near fall. Awesome used a German suplex, a power bomb and an Awesome bomb for a hot near fall. Awesome gave Tanaka a power bomb through a vertical table, but Tanaka gave Awesome a DDT through a table. Tanaka used his spinning elbow and it connected perfectly with a great camera angle for a near fall. Finally both were on the top rope pounding on each other. They were both unsteady up there, which made their blows look bad. Before Awesome did actually a sit-out powerbomb as opposed to a Tiger Driver for the pin. Spike Dudley ran in, but Jeff Jones attacked him. Spike's groupie ran in and Awesome gave her a great clothesline. I guess the ban against men on women violence is done on TNN. She bled from the mouth, probably from biting a condom. Dudley went for an acid drop on Awesome, but he threw him over the top rope through another table. Syndication seemed like the leftovers. They aired Awesome vs. Tanaka as the main event. Only 2 new matches aired and the rest was mainly repeated material. Guido beat Kalo in 4 minutes with the Maritato. No heat. Fans weren't into the wrestling early but popped when Sally Graziano put Kalo through a table, which got a pop. The other match was Kentaro Kanimura beating C.W. Anderson in 2:20 with a senton off the top rope. They also showed a clip of New Jack doing a balcony dive. Dawn Marie twisted and cut her ankle doing a cat fight sequence with Francine filming a commercial for ECW Hardcore Revolution video game that hits the street on February 17th. Tony DeVito broke his hand but isn't expected to miss any matches. ECW took the weekend off from house shows, so it's expected that this coming week's television will be replaying the angles for the pay-per-view show. The January 7th TNN taping at Center Stage in Atlanta is in a building that only holds 780 fans, so it'll be easy to pack. Not so the pay-per-view at Boutwell Auditorium in Birmingham, Alabama, which apparently has a week advance. Dusty Rhodes is expected to be involved in some form in the Atlanta show, and perhaps do a surprise cameo on the pay-per-view. WCW. Preliminary figures indicate Starrcade as a gigantic disappointment, drawing in the 0.3 to 0.4 buy rate range, and we're told a lot closer to 0.3 as things look. It was only slightly better than Fall Brawl, which was the lowest buy rate for either of the 2 big companies in the history of pay-per-view, so it makes number 2 on that worst buy rates for a major company in history list. That is reality, and I don't know how that reality can be explained away since they had months to build Hart vs. Goldberg. At this point the plan looks to be to build for Goldberg's return at Uncensored in Miami. Based on WWF failing to sell out Raw in that same building, which is Rock's hometown, the odds of doing an impressive live gate for the show, since the previous WCW Nitros in Miami were horrible and the last one didn't draw at all, don't look promising. The situation with Ric Flair at press time is this. The entire scenario as it involved Terry Funk this week was actually booked last week for Flair. In other words, they wanted Flair to come back in Greenville as commissioner, get punked again in his neck of the woods by Kevin Nash to set up a match at the sold-out pay-per-view where Flair would put up the commissioner's job against the NWO, having to break up for good, in a match that Nash would win. The two would then feud on house shows. Flair turned it down and the role was offered late in the week to Funk, who accepted it, and apparently it'll result in the same scenarios. Flair, who had been working, and even winning, at the house shows, was then pulled by the company off every future house show date after fulfilling a final commitment this week, and his future with the company is very much questionable. It is no secret that he wants to leave for the WWF and WCW doesn't want to release him. It's also no secret that Scott Hall isn't happy about his suspension and that he and Kevin Nash have been talking about wanting to leave for WWF once again, but again WCW is in the position of not wanting to give the impression to the public that stars are leaving in droves, particularly with Hogan also still on the sidelines and now in no hurry to return, figuring that waiting it out is the best political move at this point. Nitro on January 3 in Greenville, South Carolina drew 4,966 plus 2,082 comps and $153,696 for a generally poor show. In that tag team tournament where nobody wanted to win and was the single worst tournament in the history of our great sport. It started with Ron and Don Harris beating Buzzkill and Mike Rotunda. Rotunda wore a Syracuse basketball jersey over his collegiate wrestling outfit. Leia Meow was jumping up and down on a trampoline wearing a bikini top, but her implants were so hardened that the whole visual image didn't work because they didn't bounce. Isn't it amazing that pro wrestling has now come to analyzing the work of plastic surgeons? Lenny and Lodi as standards and practices covered her up and took her away. Sullivan and Rotunda beat Sandpup to zero crowd reaction. Former Nitro girl Sky, who is with Sand, is now called Miss Hancock. While Rotunda was messing around with this stupidity, Ron pinned Buzzkill with a side slam. Sullivan and Rotunda attacked the Harris twins, but the twins made their own save and cleaned house. Bret Hart arrived but was jumped by Sid in a neck brace and beaten up. After a commercial, the NWO came out and for some reason beat up the EMTs. I'm sure in the numbing excess of pro wrestling TV, probably half the viewers watching were looking for the blonde EMT with the big boobs. DDP arrived and Hennig told him the powers that be, who were again not featured, told him he had to wrestle. PG-13 were scheduled for a tag tourney match with Scott Steiner and Nash. DDP came out and they both jumped him, but of course he laid both members out with diamond cutters. Nash and Scott came out and beat the Dead Men in 10 when Nash dropped an elbow on JC Ice. The NWO then tagged PG-13. The announcers, who were mentioning names like Vern Gagne, Bob Geigel and Lou Thesz as possible commissioners, then brought up Ric Flair. Was that stupid or what? They were guaranteeing that even with Funk came out, it would be a disappointment to the masses. NWO came out with baseball bats to do an interview. Steiner had the most heat of the four. David Flair and Crowbar beat Midnight and LaRue in 5/16 of a mess. David looked terrible out here. DDP must be one hell of a worker. LaRue did a dive. Stevie Ray was at the desk unhappy about Midnight. Midnight tried to press Lash overhead and drop him on Crowbar. She almost got him up. Another double entendre. Ray tripped her and punched her. Booker T came out to save Midnight from Big Bad Stevie. Ray then hit T with a slapjack. LaRue put his finisher on Crowbar but Vito and Johnny came out while the ref was sleeping and Vito did that cool implant looking now. It didn't look like fake breasts. DDT on LaRue and Crowbar put David on top for the pin. The story was supposed to be that Disco had come out and refused to attack LaRue, but the cameras missed that one completely. So they were backstage mad at Disco for no apparent reason. Vito and Johnny were still beating up LaRue and Disco again wouldn't attack him. Lex and Liz did an interview. Luger was scheduled to wrestle Tank Abbott. Abbott came out in street clothes. This looked bad on paper, but it was even worse. Liz sprayed Abbott. Poor Abbott has no clue about selling and did it show. Luger never even touched him. Flynn came out and started throwing kicks at the blind Abbott who really didn't sell them. Rob Garner came out to introduce Funk as commissioner. They really tried to push Funk as Mr. Hardcore and even mentioned that he was last seen as Cactus Jack's partner in WWF. He called out Arn Anderson as his enforcer. The crowd vocally started chanting "We want Flair," which pretty well ruined this. Anderson did a better interview than anyone who appears on Monday Night Television. Rock's interviews may be more charismatic in delivery and get the awesome response, but for words, they aren't even in Anderson's league. It is fascinating to have wrestlers stand up for being real against the storylines written by the PTB. The fans kept chanting for Flair and I was told live this segment, which was the best thing on the TV show, killed the live crowd because they wanted Flair and felt let down he wasn't there. NWO came out. Funk, who after being away from wrestling for some time actually looked the youngest he has in many years, announced in the Hart vs. Sid match that if the NWO interferes and Hart is DQ'd, the title would change hands. Unfortunately, the title changing via DQ stip was already announced last week. He then announced Anderson as ref. He announced Sid vs. Jarrett in a powerbomb match for the US title on TV. The NWO argued with Funk. Nash actually did his best interview in about 8 months arguing with Funk and Anderson. Funk said he was going to screw Nash out of the tag titles later in the show. Didn't that Starcade Byrate tell them the public is tired of hearing that phrase? Nash threatened David Flair and Anderson and Funk freaked. Last time we saw Anderson, David Flair was killing him with a crowbar, and now he's worried sick about Nash threatening the same guy who nearly killed him. The rest of the show was spent with the NWO and Funk and Anderson searching backstage to get David, who of course would still wrestle 2 more times on the show. Bagwell and Canyon versus Smiley and Asuya in a match of two teams that each turned on each other last week. Canyon came out and ripped on how bad Bagwell's movies were, and boy is that a shoot. Canyon then gave Bagwell a bottle of champagne, and of course Bagwell broke it over Canyon's head. Smiley came out dressed like the mascot of the Greenville hockey team. As stupid as this was, it was at least funny. With Canyon out, Bagwell wrestled both until, you guessed it, Asuya turned on Smiley, allowing Buff to hit the blockbuster on Smiley for the pin in 3:03. Saturn attacked Bagwell and then went after Asuya to set up Tori Wilson replacing Asuya in the Revolution. Duggan cleaned house on everyone until they beat him down, and Saturn hit Duggan with his own 2x4 before Conan and Kidman made the save. Guerrero wasn't there because of his elbow surgery, but Mysterio Jr. actually was there also to make the save, but the cameras missed showing him. Steiner and Nash beat Harris twins. Scott, who actually is weeks away from being able to wrestle, did commentary. Sullivan and Rotunda immediately attacked the Harris twins with chairs, and Scott came from the announcing table into the ring to pin Dunn in 1:16. Daphne laughed at Anderson and Funk, but was then kidnapped by Jarrett. Bagwell and Canyon, who at this point had turned on each other twice, were scheduled to face Flair and Crowbar. Of course Flair got in the ring, and all those guys looking for him backstage still couldn't find him. Bigelow attacked Canyon, suplexing him on the entrance ramp and threw him off the stage through a table. This bump was far more dangerous than similar WWF bumps where they have all these pads set up covered in a blanket around the table when they go off the ramp, but its effect was nil since the cameras missed the shot. Also, the two girls with Canyon acted as if they could care less that their man who had survived a bottle being broken over his head was now maimed a second time. Vampiro then came out to be Bagwell's partner. Funk and Anderson then came out since they had found Flair and tried to talk him into leaving the ring, because if you remember from last week, the winner of this tournament is really the loser and nobody wants to win. David freaked out, I guess because they explained to him about the stipulation about sleeping with Asuya. Vampiro and Crowbar were flying around there trying to wrestle, but it had no chance. As it turned out, it was Vampiro's role to be the guy who Funk and Anderson beat up to get over. Bagwell, realizing he hadn't turned on anyone yet in the match, gave Vampiro the blockbuster for no reason and blew his nose on him, and he was pinned in 3:06. The NWO came out and basically teased that they were going to gang rape Daphne. Sid versus Jarrett for the US title in a match that could only end in a powerbomb saw a referee bump. Sid used the powerbomb. Ref didn't see it. The NWO ran in and Hart hit Sid with a baseball bat for the DQ in 2:31, and then they beat up some area indie wrestlers dressed up as security. Finally, Flair and Crowbar became the single worst tag team champions in the history of the organization, unless you consider Rick Steiner and Judy Bagwell as legitimate tag team champions, beating Nash and Steiner in 3:37 of the TV main event. To make things even funnier, Shivani revealed that Steiner still doesn't have medical clearance to be able to wrestle. At least when WWF did all the crap with Undertaker this year and Austin a few years back where week after week they would have matches but never wrestle, Jim Ross never said, Undertaker keeps making excuses for this because he actually is on the injured list. Nash beat both guys like jobbers the entire match. Anderson and Funk came out. Steiner started swearing on the mic. He did say one thing funny, getting mad about them calling the move a Hurricane Rana when he said it was really a Frankensteiner. Nash power bombed David. Anderson hit Nash with a crowbar and put David on top for the pin. Hart and Jarrett came out. Flair was so happy at winning the tag title that he attacked Anderson with a crowbar. Steiner and Nash beat up on Funk, who showed he was called at the last minute because when they ripped his shirt off he desperately needed a tan. Hart and Jarrett destroyed Anderson and put him in the trunk of their car and drove off. Nash power bombed Funk in the ring. Thunder tapings on January 4th in Florence, South Carolina for a show said to be tons better than Nitro, really wild, with a lot of really bad stuff and some good stuff, with the main theme that Funk got over strong as a babyface. In a cruiserweight title match, Medusa beat Asuya to keep the title. Oklahoma was back and he and Douglas were at ringside doing commentary. Oklahoma would never shut up, so Douglas actually never got a word in. Saturn screwed Asuya, well, not the way you think, causing Medusa to win. Okay, actually exactly how you think. Oklahoma then threw barbecue sauce in Medusa's eyes to set up Medusa versus Oklahoma in a feud over the cruiserweight title. And you thought they couldn't possibly make that belt more of a joke. Herrera and Psicosis came out to announce. Herrera was mad that Shivani was there and Psicosis pushed Shivani. Funk came out and slammed Psicosis through the announcer's table. It should be noted that while this was going on, they explained that Anderson had been kidnapped by the NWO and they'd beaten on him for 72 hours and they wanted a hostage situation. Jarrett made hostage demands on Funk to get Anderson released. Douglas did an interview challenging the Animals to a 6-man tag, saying Malenko and Saturn would have a mystery partner against Konnan and Kidman and Guerrero, although it doesn't look like Guerrero will be ready by then, but false advertising of talent is as much a part of the business as ring ropes and ref bumps. He did an interview to set up Ray versus Midnight, and if Midnight won, she'd be part of Harlem Heat and they'd all live happily ever after. But if Ray won, she wouldn't be part of the team and she'd have to scream. NWO continued their 72 hours of torture on Anderson. At this point they made him watch every Nitro since April in a row and were starting to threaten him with thunders. 3-count beat PG-13 and Chavo Jr. David Daphne, no longer kidnapped, and Crowbar were watching Anderson get tortured. I think the next step was to start showing him Sid Vicious matches over and over. Crowbar and Daphne were laughing, but that was too much for David, who suddenly teased being sane and walked off. Wall beat Flynn when Abbott, outdoing color, in a match that was billed as shoot-fight rules, which meant no pinfalls. This does get funnier, so bear with me, and only could end with a knockout or tap out. Punched Flynn. Wall then pinned Flynn. Abbott then punched Dillinger again. Jarrett beat Smiley in a bunkhouse match. Flair came out and began choking Jarrett with a crowbar, and Funk handcuffed Jarrett and held him hostage and gave the NWO 2 minutes to come out. After a commercial break, they came out holding Anderson hostage. They had hostage release talks. In the midst of the talks they set up the Funk vs. Nash match on the pay-per-view with the Stips under hardcore rules, whatever they are. Funk also demanded a hardcore match with Hart later in the show. Funk and the NWO then exchanged hostages. Ray destroyed Midnight the entire match and kept refusing to pin her. You know that story, she small packages him and won, so she earned her spot on the team. They all hugged. Ray then hit Booker T with a slapjack and left. Okerlund was interviewing the Filthy Animals. Guerrera came out with a blonde who he said had the hots for Jean, so Jean left with her and that left Guerrera doing the interviews. As Jean was leaving, he still did one more interview with DDP filled with double entendres about Bagwell really being gay, talking about why Bagwell got divorced, and saying things like everyone knows the girls like Bagwell but so do the boys. He challenged Bagwell to come out and they ended up brawling into the arena. Guerrera interviewed Bigelow. Canyon broke a bottle on Bigelow's head. Mr. Biggs, formerly Clarence Mason, wasn't at TV either Monday or Tuesday. Nash was supposed to wrestle Bigelow. See, it's another way for Nash to not have to actually ever wrestle. Steiner and Jarrett beat up the KO'd Bigelow with bat shots, put him in a wheelbarrow and wheeled him from the back to the ring. Nash hit him with a bat and pinned him. David and Crowbar kept the tag titles, beating Konnan and Kidman. Crowbar versus the Animals was said to have been good and David against them was said to have been brutally bad. Anderson came to ringside and hit Konnan with a crowbar and David pinned him. Finally, the hardcore match with Hart vs. Funk had no ending. Said to be pretty good, lasting about 6 minutes. It was mainly trading chair and garbage can shots and was said to have been amusing in a pathetic way to see Hart in that kind of a total garbage style match. Hart decked ref Charles Robinson. Backstage, Anderson went to put on the ref shirt, but David told him he wanted to ref instead. David put the shirt on and locked Anderson in a room. NWO, who were banned from ringside as part of the hostage agreement, came out anyway and destroyed both Funk and Flair, with a show ending with Nash powerbombing Funk through a gimmicked part of the stage. The first Wednesday Night Thunder will be January 12th. Bob Mould quit the company early last week. Mould, a legend in the alternative rock world, was originally hired to be part of the booking committee under Nash. When Russo and Ferrara were hired, his input pretty well diminished to almost nothing, and people close to the situation noted his love affair with the wrestling business also burned out quickly when they wouldn't pay much attention to his ideas. He was described as being not very outgoing at the meetings, but his ideas made a lot of sense and he wasn't given a chance. The most notable idea we're told from him was on the Starrcade pay-per-view show. He came up with the idea that Sting would have silly string in the mace bottle so prove he wasn't fooled by Elizabeth's turn. Of course that idea made perfect sense, because after proving he wasn't fooled, he stood there and let her hit him in the face with a baseball bat. Alternative Press, in its year-end issue, named ICP its Band of the Year. In an interview with them in the issue, there were a few references to pro wrestling. Violent J said one thing came out of wrestling: we're addicted to painkillers now. But just on the road. The thing is, we're still like super nerds. We wouldn't know how to get any pills ourselves. If we were going to, we'd be asking people, did you get an operation recently? Hart suffered a concussion being dropped on his head during the Goldberg match at Starrcade. It wasn't Hart driving the monster truck, nor was Sid in the car that was being run over, although both were the original plan. Hart was told what part of the car to drive over and where Sid would in the car so as not to drive over him. Hart refused, saying that he wasn't an experienced stunt driver and felt if they were going to use a monster truck and drive over a car and go to that expense, they should go to the expense to have professional stunt men do the stunt. There was no problem with his decision, and based on everything he was actually apologized to about even being asked. Perry Saturn on the Law Wrestling radio show called Sting the most overrated wrestler in the business, saying he's been doing the same match for 10 years, which apparently was the latest thing that drew him some heat. Saturn also suffered a hip pointer doing that superplex spot with Asuya on the December 27th Nitro. The Best of Nitro special was pretty good, with the announcers sitting around discussing the 4+ years of Nitro history, sort of leaving out the historical fact of its collapse, although it isn't like anyone thought they'd get that detailed. After watching everything all over again, the greatest moment in Nitro, and one of the greatest moments ever in wrestling, was Ric Flair's return in Greenville. Nothing else had anywhere close to the impact. The only other thing that actually would make one take notice was remembering just how great a wrestler Ultimo Dragon really was. It was also really funny to see the announcers building to a spot that in the original format was going to be a Mysterio Jr. and Guerrero vs. Psicosis and Parka match to talk about the influence of the Luchadores on the show. But as was apropos for their usage in the company, in the editing process, the spot was taken off the show due to time constraints. Hart hasn't written his Calgary Sun column in 2 weeks because he's going to completely change the theme and tone of the column, but wanted to explain why and not get it lost in the holidays. The WCW movie Ready to Rumble tentatively is set for an April 17th theatrical release. Chris Kanyon, who handled both the wrestling choreography and was also the stunt double for Oliver Platt in the wrestling scenes, was the liaison between the movie producers and WCW. He got picked because of his previous experience in handling the wrestling choreography in the Jesse Ventura movie. He got that role because he helped train Jay Leno to wrestle, and Leno was asked by the NBC producers if he knew anyone who could handle the wrestling end. DDP has the most wrestling scenes of all the WCW wrestlers, followed by Goldberg. A funny thing involving the movie is it's basically a story about a wrestler getting screwed out of the title by a promoter. I have no idea where this idea ever came from, and 2 goofy fans urging him to make a comeback and regain it in a shoot. Anyway, both Kanyon and DDP tried to get the director to change the finish of the movie from whatever it was supposed to be to the idea that at the end it all comes out that everything in the movie was actually a work. Shane Douglas on WWF Live said that the Revolution would be dumping Asuya and bringing in a new woman. He didn't mention the name Tori Wilson, but that was certainly the plan months ago. Kanyon, when appearing on Wrestling Observer Live, said that when he used to come up with a lot of his unique moves, the guy he'd try them out on at the power plant was Lash LaRue. This was before LaRue had any television role. He said that LaRue, who was married and had a family, would still make a 90-mile drive in each direction daily to the power plant to attend the classes. At this point, nobody from WCW management has called Bruno Sammartino about doing anything. Ric Flair's youngest daughter Ashley made the cheerleading All-American team in her age group at a competition this past week in Nashville. Fitness model Madaja claims on her website that she's signed to become a new Nitro girl. House shows for the week saw December 28th in Beaumont, Texas, which was originally scheduled as a Thunder taping, drew 2,396, paying $50,795. WCW Saturday night tapings, originally scheduled to end at the end of January, remain on the schedule indefinitely. The plan, as mentioned before, was to set 7 WCW Saturday night matches every week at the Tuesday Thunder tapings, with a few matches before and a few matches after, but at this point that seems to have been scrapped. Major show schedule for March through June. March 1st is Saturday night taping in Bismarck, North Dakota. March 5th house show in Charlotte. March 6th Nitro in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. March 7th Thunder in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. March 10th in Birmingham, England. March 11th in London, England at the Arena. March 12th in Manchester Arena in England. March 13th Nitro in Providence, Rhode Island. March 14th Thunder in Fairfax, Virginia. March 15th Saturday night taping in Salem, Virginia. March 19th uncensored pay-per-view in Miami at the American Airlines Arena. March 20th Nitro in Gainesville, Florida. March 21st Thunder in Orlando, Florida. March 27th Nitro Spring Breakout in South Padre Island, Texas at the Sheraton Hotel. March 28th Thunder in San Antonio at the Alamodome. Boy, does that sound scary in a 70,000-seat arena. March 29th Saturday night taping in Corpus Christi. March 30th house show in Baltimore. March 31st house show in Pittsburgh. April 1st house show in Toronto. April 3rd Nitro in Worcester, Massachusetts. April 4th Thunder in Durham, New Hampshire. April 10th Nitro in Denver. April 11th Thunder in Colorado Springs, Colorado. April 12th Saturday Night Taping in Des Moines, Iowa. April 16th Spring Stampede Pay-Per-View in Chicago. April 17th Nitro in Indianapolis. April 18th Thunder in Rockford, Illinois. April 24th Nitro in Rochester, New York. April 25th Thunder in Syracuse, New York. April 26th Saturday Night Taping in Glens Falls, New York, May. 1st Nitro in Birmingham, Alabama, May. 2nd Thunder in Memphis, May. 7th Pay-Per-View in Kansas City, May. 8th Nitro in St. Louis at the TWA Dome, May. 9th Saturday Night Taping in Springfield, Illinois, May. 15th Nitro in Biloxi, Mississippi, May. 16th Thunder in Lafayette, Louisiana, May. 22nd Nitro in Grand Rapids, Michigan, May. 23rd Thunder in Saginaw, Michigan, May. 29th Nitro in Salt Lake City, May. 30th Thunder in Boise, Idaho. June 5th Nitro in Atlanta at Phillips Arena. June 6th Thunder in Greenville, South Carolina. June 11th Great American Bash Pay-Per-View in Baltimore. June 12th Nitro in Richmond, Virginia. June 13th Thunder in Norfolk, Virginia. June 17th House Show in Milwaukee. June 19th Nitro in Billings, Montana. June 20th Thunder in Bozeman, Montana. June 26th Nitro in Vancouver, BC. June 27th Thunder in Seattle. And if you thought Starrcade was bad in English, it was worse in German. WCW pay-per-views air live in Germany on the pay channel Premiere World. Usually they get the video feed from the US, and German announcing is done in a studio in Munich. Similar to how WCW and ECW PPVs air in Japan, WWF pay-per-view shows don't air in Japan. Anyway, for the first time, the German crew was in Washington, D.C. live. The regular commentators were joined by a comedian named Tom Gerhardt, who was very popular in Germany 10 years ago because he used to go on stage dressed as a giant penis and pretend to ejaculate on the audience. His fame with that skit was very short-lasting. Anyway, he was doing heel commentary to get himself over, calling Disco Inferno Guy, talking about Medusa having nice tits, and said in commentary that none of the punches touched the other wrestlers, that pro wrestling is all fake and he could beat any of them up. He even stood up when Benoit made the open challenge to anyone and challenged him. This was all done to build to a match where Gerhardt will wrestle Berlin on February 12th in Oberhausen, Germany on the WCW House Show. That show will be airing as a live TV special on the station in Germany, and the building is nearly sold out as the Germany tour is doing well. German wrestler Ulf Hermann, upon hearing this news, issued a grandstand challenge saying he's going to be at the show, which got enough pub that the promoters of the German tour said that Hermann won't be wrestling on the show because he had never trained at the power plant, which was actually quite humorous because Hermann actually did train at the power plant at one time. Anyway, we're told the Hermann thing isn't an angle, but if they work an angle at the show, I guess we can say it was the beginning of one. WWF. Raw on January 3rd at the Miami Arena drew 9,272, paying $233,288. Rock, who said he finally came back home, put over some Dolphins and Ziggy Marley and was getting his usual unreal pops before calling out Triple H. Triple H said he'd love to wrestle him but wanted the belt, and instead told Rock he's have a 1-on-3 match where Rock would be fired if he lost against Outlaws and X-Pac. Dudleys beat Too Cool via DQ in 3:16 when Rikishi destroyed both Dudleys for the DQ. During the match the Posse came out and attacked Rikishi, but the Acolytes saved him. Triple H told Blackman if he hit Kane with the kendo stick in the match with Angle that he'd be fired. This is pretty amusing. Angle beat Kane via DQ in 2:23 when Kane choke slammed Angle, but Blackman then hit Angle with the stick instead, so the ref DQ'd Kane for outside interference. Angle was knocked out, but he maintained his undefeated streak. Stephanie McMahon was out saying she was going to settle the IC title controversy. She brought out Chyna and Jericho, both to mixed reactions. Basically the men cheered Jericho and the women cheered Chyna. She announced both were champions, but if either loses the match, they both lose the title. In other words, they have to keep interfering to protect the other to keep the title. This is right out of 1970s Los Angeles wrestling, when for months they had two different America's champions. It didn't work then, but that was then. Bob Holly came out and wanted a shot, so he wrestled Chyna, had her beat, but Jericho interfered to save her and Chyna pinned him in 154 with a sunset flip. Triple H won the title pinning show in 7:07 with a low blow and pedigree. Amazingly clean heel title win. Like shocking. Match didn't have much heat early, but it was about as good as you can get with Show in there, and it got good by the finish. He's at least got a lot more stamina with all the weight he's dropped. The controversy was supposed to be that Triple H used a low blow behind the ref's back. The funny part of this is the ref was looking right at the Titantron, which 10 times larger than life right in front of his eyes. He could see the low blow. Nobody has figured out how the Titantron changes officiating in pro wrestling, so they need to have a commissioner make a ruling that anything a referee sees on the Titantron he really doesn't see. It's not hard. Just pretend that referees have given contact lenses so they see only things dogs see, since we all know dogs can't decipher images on a television screen. Either that or distract the refs in the direction facing away from the screen. They had balloons coming from the ceiling and major pyro. They put this on at the end of the first hour so it would be head-to-head with the Nitro main event. They at least made the title seem important. Bossman and Albert beat Moolah and Young in Test in 141 when Albert pinned Test after a high kick. Bossman and Albert after the match laid out Moolah and Young, and also Henry and Whippleman when they tried to save their beautiful girlfriends. Triple H celebrated the title win. They also did 3 skits with Helmsley mocking Mick Foley about not being able to get a job now that he's not in wrestling. The idea was funny, but they did at least one too many sketches. Acolytes challenged the posse with one hand tied behind their backs. This only went 31 seconds before the Dudleys attacked the Acolytes for the DQ and laid them out with a chain and pipe. Posse whipped Acolytes with their belts like a government mule, as Jim Ross said. At some point somebody does need to explain what exactly a government mule is. Jeff Hardy beat Snow in a cage match in 601. We all thought the purpose of the cage was to have Hardy do some unbelievable spots. But actually the purpose was to lock Terry Runnels in and have her climb the cage and try to escape in a short dress. It should be mentioned this was the most toned-down Raw in more than a year. Rock told off Briscoe and Patterson, who thought he was going to lose and have to leave. They were the only 2 in the building who even considered it a possibility. It was amazing seeing Rock in his hometown, going 1-on-3 against 3 top heels, and literally nobody thought for a second he was going to lose at any point. It was still a pretty good match. The crowd never took it seriously when Rock was about to get pinned, but popped huge for his comebacks. Rock used the elbow on Dog, but Gunn pulled the ref out of the ring to stop the count. Finally Foley came out of the crowd and hit X-Pac and Triple H with a chair, and Rock used the rock bottom on Gunn for the pin in 916. Both Moolah, who started in the late 40s, and Young, who according to records from the early 50s say started as a pro in 1942 at the age of 18, although apparently she's now revising history and claiming to have started in 1939 to make her the first 8-decade performer ever, would join Luthez, whose first match was in 1935 and final match in 1990, and maybe Al Costello. Did he ever do a match in 1990 as he was wanting to do because he debuted in 1939, as the only known 7-decade performers in pro wrestling. Abdullah the Butcher would become a 6-decade performer with his first match of the year. If Bruno Sammartino really steps in the ring for WCW, he would as well. Some of the refs in Mexico, Roberto Rangel, El Pompin, Tigre Hispano and El Fresero, and probably others we don't know about, also date back to the late 50s. SmackDown on December 28 in Richmond, airing 2 nights later, was largely based around getting Mick Foley back up to main event status with bumpers of his most famous WWF moments and an at-home style interview, very good one at that, with Jim Ross, leading to the Cactus Jack return. Based on the interview, where he said he had one goal left of headlining WrestleMania and talked of leaving on his own terms, we're almost left with the idea they may do a 3-way at Mania with Rock, Cactus Jack and Triple H, either that or do a double headliner type of match. I can see a finish where Cactus Jack gives Rock the win at the end of the show and they have a curtain call together, or a situation where if he wants to stick around and have a heel run, that he swerves everyone and costs Rock the title. Prince Albert and Big Boss Man beat Test in a handicap match in 308. Bossman was still shaken up from 2 weeks earlier, so actually never tagged in, but delivered a nightstick shot to set Albert up for the win using the high kick. Test nearly killed Albert with a messed up salto, but overall Test worked real hard. Snow did an interview saying he wanted Foley's spot, and Triple H said they'd give him a bonus if he beats Jeff Hardy. Angle beat Fatu in 50. This was just enough time for them to establish that Triple H ordered Blackman handcuffed to the corner and that Stephanie gave him the key, so he unlocked himself, hit Fatu with a stick, and Angle pinned him. Stephanie then tortured Tori by telling her that Rock was a serial violator. Jeff Hardy beat Snow in 458 when Matt hit Snow with a chair. Good TV bout. Hollies beat Moolah and Mae Young in 229 when Crash pinned Young after a power slam. Young used a Bronco Buster on Crash. Actually, she tripped on the way. Young took one bump after another. I have no idea how she can do that. After the match, the Hollies also destroyed Harvey Whippleman and Mark Henry trying to save their babes. Rock pinned Kane in 5:13 of a good match with great heat. It was all action. They did a spot where Rock threw Kane off the entrance ramp and he took a bump into what appeared to be a pit with a table and tons of padding underneath. Kane came back and choke-slammed Rock through a table. Kane clotheslined Tori by accident and Rock then hit Kane with a really weak chair shot. It didn't matter, Rock can do no wrong these days, and got the pin with the rock bottom. Triple H told X-Pac that if he didn't beat Big Show he was fired. Jericho drew Chyna in an IC title match with one of those double pins with two refs out there each counting one person's shoulders down, and Tim White left with the belt in 350. Not particularly good. I guess they have a storyline going with Chyna, but the more you see her in the ring, the less you want to ever see her again in the ring. They did do a good false finish where Chyna gave Jericho a really sloppy pedigree and a second ref ran in for the near fall count. Farouk DDQ Bubba Ray Dudley in 119 when their partners interfered. Mean Street Posse helped Dudley's in leaving the Acolytes laying. Bradshaw has a lot of Scott Norton in him in that he didn't even want to stay down from a 5-on-2 attack where the whole idea was to be left laying. Viscera and Jacqueline beat Gangrel and Luna in 227 when Viscera power-slammed Luna. It made no sense to even have this match until you realized the entire purpose was to have BB come out in her EMT role to put Luna on a stretcher. Now they have to do at least one stretcher job per show, so the EMT girl came make her appearance. X-Pac vs. Show ended up as all of DX vs. Show as one by one Triple H added the members including himself to the match. After a hard chair shot, Show bladed and all four guys destroyed him until X-Pac made the pin in 619. On the WWF Eve of Destruction show, they called the Edge and Christian vs. Hardy Boys ladder match the best match of the year. You didn't see WCW doing anything close to that for Juventud Guerrera vs. Blitzkrieg. Actually, they never even brought the match up on television after it happened and basically took both guys off pay-per-view for the rest of the year after the match, and then last month quietly fired Blitzkrieg, Jeremiah Ross, who is now working on computer visuals and not even working in wrestling. I think Blitzkrieg is going to be the first rookie ever to get a Match of the Year nomination that doesn't even have a job by the end of his first full year. All of this may not seem important at first glance, but it really does exemplify in a nutshell much of what happened in 1999 and also much of what will happen in 2000 and 2001 and why some people will be stars in 2 years and why others with more talent won't be. Out of all the network TV shows, SmackDown ranked as the fourth youngest, skewing audience with a median age of 23.2 of its viewers, behind only WB programs Popular, Mission Hall and Dawson's Creek, and not behind any of them by much. In comparison, NBC's Thursday Night Hits Friends has a median age of 36.5 and Frasier was 41.4, and NFL Monday Night Football's median age is 43.7. The primetime network averages were ABC at 41.5, CBS at 53.1, Fox at 33.7, NBC at 45.0, UPN at 31.8, and WB at 28.7. Those numbers would scare me greatly if I was in the upper echelon of management at the three big networks. Angle in Alex Mervez column on WrestlingObserver.com was the first person I've ever heard saying, if you want to be a pro wrestler, you're better off not having an amateur wrestling background. How's this for evidence of just how weird and how little sense the stock market actually makes? There was a story in the January 1st San Jose Mercury about the 90 local companies that had IPOs this year and how they performed on the market based on their first day open and their end of the year close. They listed the top 10 and bottom 10 of those 90 on the list in a chart. If WWFE had been on the chart, it would have been the second worst performing of all the 90 IPOs, 34 public open, 17 year-end price, and that's up from 14 March 16th the previous day, with a 50% drop from its opening to the public to its December 31st close. One company opened at 24 and its stock was at 250, which was the biggest gain. Here's the funny thing. Of all those stocks both on the top and bottom 10, 19 of the 20 companies lost money, just about all of them in the millions. The stock that went from 24 to 250 actually lost $33.5 million during the year, which is all very confusing. The only one of those 20 companies that made money actually earned less profit this year than WWF would do in an average 4-day period. WWF earned about $56 million in profits last year and is on track to do about $70 million this coming fiscal year, but its stock plummeted from its open. Worse than 99% of the IPO opens based in San Jose, virtually none of which were profitable. The story did mention WWF stock, saying how people buy it to brag they own a piece of it, but not mentioning how poorly in comparison to its earnings it performed. To be even more confusing, last year, among companies on the stock market that actually made a profit, as a whole their stock prices dropped 2%. Among companies that lost money last year, as a whole their stock prices increased 50%. Vince McMahon was on the WWF audio show saying that they wanted to use Jim Carrey on TV but he was too busy, and didn't seem happy about that. He claimed they might be taking the PTC to court. Good luck on that one, guys. and that they were marketing a clothing line for kids 18 to 24 months of age. He also said Shawn Michaels would be back. Geez, what do you think? He's going to pay a guy $15,000 per week and never bring him back. WWF The Music Volume 4 increased to 110,304 units sold this past week due to the Christmas season, but fell to number 48 in the charts. WCW Mayhem remained at number 122, but grew to 37,555 units sold. In the Billboard magazine annual sports video charts, the WWF for 1999 had the 11 best-selling videos. In this order: Austin 3:16, "'Cause Stone Cold Said So", Rock, "Know Your Role", Hell Yeah Stone Cold Saga Continues, Reset of Survivor Series, Best of Raw Volume 1, Best of WrestleManias 1 and 14, Sable Unleashed, Undertaker the Phenom and the Three Faces of Foley. The highest-ranking non-WWF video would be Michael Jordan at number 12. Why pro wrestling and WWF in particular, which always protest that they aren't sports, are in sports listings as opposed to entertainment listings where they wouldn't dominate, is an interesting question. Other WWF videos in the top 20 were DX at number 14 and Women of the WWF at number 19. WCW had two of the top two in Sting Unmasked at number 16 and Goldberg at number 20. The WWF was all over Entertainment Year in Review articles, in particularly TV Year in Review articles, since Raw dominated cable, and probably even more so for publicity purposes. The lower-rated SmackDown became the star program on UPN, probably keeping the network out of extinction. Shamrock did not undergo arthroscopic knee surgery, but apparently WWF believed it because he was actually called by Bruce Pritchard and asked how his knee was doing. There is nothing definite regarding when he'll return, but he is cleared medically to return and has been for 2 weeks. The New York Times Magazine on January 2nd, in a series on people who had died over the past year, mentioned Gorilla Monsoon. The piece basically talked about Monsoon being a top heel when wrestling wasn't nearly as popular as it is today. The writer met Monsoon in the 80s at a steakhouse when talking about wrestling's growth and said it's comic books, with no apparent disdain in his voice. Then when asked about what wrestling was in his day, he said, "I don't know, but we were more serious. People really thought I was the devil incarnate. Now it's all a joke." The Rock's autobiography, which is officially released on January 5th, is number 7 in the Amazon.com book orders for pre-sales. The Baltimore Sun ran an article on Mick Foley's literary success on December 12. In the article, Foley said that he would be writing another book. When asked about his retirement, he said that he's very concerned about his physical condition now. "I plan to retire soon, but I just don't feel I can leave the company hanging with Steve Austin out." With all modesty, to lose Mick Foley on the heels of losing Steve Austin would put the company in a tough position. "So I'm going to hang in there for a few more months." When asked about the scene and Beyond the Mat with his kids' reaction to the chair shots in the match at the Royal Rumble, he said, "I ended up being hit many more times than I should have, and, unfortunately, my kids were in the front row, and they were just devastated by it. And then I was devastated when I watched the footage of them watching it. That was when I made the conscious effort to cut way back on the amount of times I got hit with a chair. I think I've only been hit 3 or 4 times in the last year." SmackDown on December 28 in Richmond, Virginia drew a sellout 9,053, paying $254,791. December 29 in Nashville drew 14,090, paying $369,493. December 30 in Memphis for the final show of the year drew a sellout 18,008, paying $418,485. Nashville and Memphis were largely the same shows, using Rock over Triple H as the main event plus Road Dogg and X-Pac over Kane and Edge. Jericho did not have the IC title belt for his matches with Snow on the shows. Lawler worked both Nashville and Memphis, and due to his history in both cities, actually drew tremendous babyface pops, second only to Rock both nights. Merchandise from December 28 SmackDown through January 3 Raw was $338,540 or $6.71 per head. Stock closed on January 4 at 15th of May. 8th. March major show lineup is House Show March 3 in Toronto, Raw March 6 in Springfield, SmackDown March 7 in Boston, Raw March 13 in East Rutherford, New Jersey, SmackDown March 14 in Uniondale, New York, March 20 Raw in Chicago, March 21 SmackDown in Milwaukee, March 27 Raw in Houston, March 28 SmackDown in San Antonio. TV Guide is planning another set of 4 covers in the next few weeks. The Reader's Pages. Lucha Libre History. The Top 10 Stories of 1999 in Lucha Libre. 1. The Economy. The Mexican economy stabilized in 1999. The peso stayed between 9 and 10 to a dollar all year. It's generally assumed in economics that economic uncertainty holds back discretionary spending. Since the economy stabilized, uncertainty dropped and attendance boomed, relatively speaking. Certainly Mexico is still a third world country economically, and there are no short-term prospects. But short-term, it appears the promoters have a fighting chance to draw depending upon their own promotional skill. 2. EMLL's rising attendance. In May 1993, AAA split off from EMLL. In December 1994, President Ernesto Zedillo Ponce de Leon floated the peso, a devaluation that led to a major economic crisis in Mexico that still isn't over. Those two events drove a major stake into EMLL attendance until this year. For reasons not easily explained, starting on December 20, 1998, EMLL attendance took off and they had their best year since 1993. Had Arena Mexico been in a safer part of town, it might have been even better. Due to the devaluation of the peso and the economic crash, a sellout at 1999 ticket prices is still not anywhere near as profitable as a sellout at 1993 prices. Wrestlers were able to work more dates, make a little more money, and have a little more confidence in the future. Every wrestler in Mexico makes poor money by US standards, but even lower-rung wrestlers in the two major offices make a solid income by Mexican standards relative to the country's average. 3. Big name deaths. Rodolfo Cavernario Galindo, Caballero Tigra, Pedro Bolanos, Valente Perez, Wolf Ruvinskis to Javier Cuauhtemoc Diablo Velasco. The world of lucha libre lost many big names. Of the names listed, all but Bolanos were legitimately among the 25 most influential people ever involved in lucha libre. 4. AAA scales back. During 1999, AAA became more and more a traveling television taping promotion and less a national organization. The company held 59 television tapings in 1999 and by their own estimates, sold out more than two-thirds of them. They ran almost exclusively in northern Mexico and a lot in border cities. Antonio Pena cut out almost all house shows, simply licensing his name out and taking booking fees to allow local promoters to use his wrestlers. At the end of the year, Pena let his first and second match wrestlers go. With his TV cut back to 90 minutes, Pena was set to focus on only his top 50 wrestlers in 2000. 5. The retirement tour of Pero Aguayo. In late 1998, Pedro Aguayo announced he'd retire. Obviously his definition of retire is different than mine. Aguayo, born January 28, 1946, debuted in pro wrestling in January 1970 and wanted to wrestle one last time in every major arena in Mexico. By the end of the year, he'd worked every major arena that uses AAA talent. Aguayo has frequently said, including once on AAA television with Pena standing right next to him, that he wants to finish his career with one match at Arena Coliseo and one match at Arena Mexico for EMLL. It is widely assumed Aguayo will do that in 2000, and several magazines and newspaper stories have hinted his final match will have him put hit hair up against the Masked Fishman. 6. Mexican TV begins the transformation to American-style TV. The trend was noticed in two ways. Both companies drastically shortened their TV matches. Many matches, especially with EMLL, were made one fall. Most TV main events lasted less than 10 minutes. In AAA in particular, the storyline became more important to the TV show than the action in the ring, although this trend is nowhere near as pronounced as it is with US promotions. AAA spent a lot of time doing a romance angle with Pentagon and first Chichital Hamada and later Esther Moreno. AAA briefly turned Tirantes by having him save Tirantes Jr. plus Tirantes, easily the most pushed heel in Mexico of the decade, finally lost his hair, which turned out to be an extreme letdown considering a 6-year build-up. His face turned flopped as AAA seemed lost without a heel referee in its booking. By the end of the year, with no story, Tirantes was back as a heel. EMLL finally tried US style in October, having Brazo de Plata feud with Pierroth Jr. over his pet pig. The first 2 weeks of the angle were funny. The last 8 weeks, the angle died and so did the feud at the box office, leading to the worst year-end main event and finish in history in December. 7. Super Astro loses his mask, hints at retirement. Super Astro debuted in 1974 in Tijuana at the age of 13. He was the first super over tiny high-risk daredevil in Mexico, being a mere lightweight when he started. He was the inspiration for a generation of Tijuana luchadores, including Psicosis and Rey Mysterio Jr. In 1992, he opened a cafeteria called El Cuadrilátero in Mexico City, former wrestler Babyface. As his push died out, not in small part due to the fact he did the same routine in every match for years, and the profits from his restaurant grew, The writing was on the wall. On December 25, 1999, he finally lost his mask after 25 years and revealed himself to be Juan Cesare Ramirez. 8. Mr. Njpw wins 2 major mask matches in 5 weeks. Over a 5-week period in August and September, Mr. Njpw won the masks of the IWRG Mr. Njpw, now Mr. Mexico, shocker, at the 66th anniversary show. The match with Mr. Mexico was the match of the year in Mexico. The two had never worked against each other until 7 days earlier, yet put on a beautifully worked, timed and executed match. 9. Scorpio Jr. loses his mask. Capping a feud that lasted almost a year, Scorpio Jr. lost his mask in a tag team match, revealing his name as Rafael Nunez Jr. Scorpio Jr. put up his mask and the hair of Bestia Salvaje against the mask of El Hijo del Santo and the hair of Negro Casas at Arena Mexico, drawing a near sellout. Even though Scorpio Jr. had been wrestling without his mask since January for the WWF Super Astros television show as El Bandito, it was still a big deal in Mexico. 10. WWF stops using Mexican talent and Super Astros fails. To a large extent, this is more an American story than a Mexican story, especially as the number and percentage of Hispanics in the United States continues to rise. The WWF, for a whole host of small reasons, failed to renew Super Astros, and thus the work for all the Mexicans under contract to the organization except Mr. Aguila, Papi Chulo, dried up. Oddly, just as the WWF gave up on pushing Tarzan Boy as its biggest Latin star, EMLL grabbed him and tried to repeat the 1995 Hector Garza push with him to create a new headliner. Here's what I thought were the top 10 stories of the 90s. The first 2 were much bigger than all the others. 1. TV is broadcast in Mexico City, and then nationwide. This led to a strike, more TV-friendly performers and angles, far fewer promotions, far fewer magazines, far fewer wrestlers being employed, but also created huge megastars like Vampiro, Conan and Octagon. 2. The economic collapse of 1994. The economy hasn't recovered since. This has resulted in driving hundreds of aspiring wrestlers out of the business and severely reduced the pay for those who remained. This also led to the northern and border cities being closer to the healthy American economy, of much greater importance as the decade ended. 3. Antonio Peña forms AAA. He split off from EMLL, with the backing of TV giant Televisa, creating a second promotion with national television exposure. 4. Triple Mania I. The card, held April 30, 1993 before 50,000 fans at Plaza Mexico, also marked the beginning of the end for AAA. In retrospect, the retirement loss by Conan in his match with Cien Caras was the single most important result of a wrestling match anywhere in the world during the decade. Had Conan stayed retired, in the long run, it might have been remembered as the angle that made AAA a major league promotion. 5. And the ultimate end of AAA came after the death of Art Barr. In November 1994, Barr was the best heel in wrestling at the time. AAA probably had the best wrestling talent and the best matches in the world. The 1 and 2 punch of stories 4 and 5 hurt AAA both as far as TV ratings, to the point that within 12 months, Televisa pulled out a lot of its support. 6. AAA runs successfully in the United States. The AAA shows in Los Angeles, until the When Worlds Collide pay-per-view, were drawing better than any arena in the United States that was running WWF and WCW wrestling. 7. Rayo de Jalisco Jr. vs. Cien Caras. So many fans crowded into Arena Mexico to see the match on September 21, 1991 by Rayo, that the top level of the facility cracked. This led to closing the building for 5 weeks, right when the promotion was the hottest it had ever been. 8. The UWA faded into oblivion. UWA, technically Lucha Libre International, started the decade as the strongest promotion in Mexico and a major office throughout the world. Founded in 1975 by Francisco Flores with wrestlers like Anibal and Rey Mendoza, who were unhappy with EMLL office politics, the promotion was on fire from its inception through 1992. In the late 80s, Flores died and the company was never the same. Flores was succeeded by son-in-law Carlos Maines, who along with Connect, booked the company so horribly, starting a steady stream of screwed jobs and non-finishes in main events, that they eventually turned the audience off. If you look back at their cards, you see they had some amazing talent on almost every show. 9. La Pista Arena Revolucion closed. Mexico's version of Korakuen Hall, which ran 3 shows every week, closed down in 1996. 10. The major deaths of 1999. The 10 most important matches of the decade were: 1. Conan vs. Cien Caras, April 30, 1993. 2. Rayo de Jalisco Jr. vs. Cien Caras, September 21, 1993. Vampiro vs. Connect, January 31, 1992, giving Vampiro the UWA World Heavyweight title, ultimately derailed his career. He could have been a bigger star, but the fans turned against him as world champion because he wasn't ready. 4. Lob Parka vs. Pierroth Jr. July 20, 1998. 5. Blue Panther vs. Love Machine April 2, 1992. 6. Blue Panther vs. Love Machine June 1993. 7. Conan vs. Jake Roberts vs. Cien Cars August 28, 1993. 8. Octagon and El Hijo del Santo vs. Love Machine and Eddie Guerrero November 6, 1990. Frank as the best match of the decade. 9. Octagon vs. Fuerza Guerrera January 31, 1991. 10. El Hijo del Santo vs. Negro Casas October 1, 1998. Sold out Arena Mexico when at the time the company wasn't drawing flies. Steve Dr. Lucha Sims. Chula Vista, California. Russo. What Vince Russo is doing in WCW is not wrestling. It's a burlesque show featuring a motley cast of characters, the majority of which were once pro wrestlers. The clean finish has been virtually eliminated in the name of advancing storylines. The world title has been rendered completely worthless. None of the participants have gotten any sort of a meaningful win on their way to the finals. The champion is the guy who has the most friends at ringside and the most outside interference the day of the show. No match goes more than 3 minutes without a run-in. It's so predictable. I attack you during your match. You come back and attack me during my match. Now the booking team has given some airtime to the luchadores in an insulting piñata match that was merely a new variation of the big man beats up a bunch of little guys angles for Steve Williams. The Jim Ross angle was no worse than the Big Show having cancer angle. The main problem seems to be that there's no control valve for the creativity. If something is awful, or even excellent, it's just there 1 minute and gone the next. Nothing sinks in with the viewer. Isn't anyone in the front office telling Russo this? Apparently not. The current strategy may cut into the WWF's audience, but WCW no longer represents competition to the WWF. It's a watered-down WWF. If it works, Russo will be hailed as a company savior, much like Eric Bischoff was praised for being 3 years ago. Jeffrey Cohen. Flushing, New York. It's become pretty clear to me who was the creative genius behind the WWF's surge in popularity. Let's see, Vince Russo has shoved Jeff Jarrett down our throats without mercy, pushed Meng, brought in Tank Abbott, is building the TV around all the old guys in the year 2000 and brought back Roddy Piper. What's Vince McMahon done? He's gotten Moolah and Mae Young over. Now that's a genius. Don't get me wrong. Jarrett is a decent worker. He just can't talk and he doesn't have a good look. He'll wind up as Russo's DDP. A guy who gets the world strap because he's friends with the boss, not because he's over at championship level with the fans, and he'll never be over his champion potential as long as he can't have any clean matches. Tim Lewis. Jeffersonville, Indiana. I have a comment about Nitro changing to 2 hours. I think it's kind of pointless. Vince Russo swears Nitro will be such a better show at 2 hours, but I couldn't disagree more. The length of the show has nothing to do with the quality of the show. When Nitro first went to 3 hours, it was still a good program. The drop in quality came when Eric Bischoff and Kevin Nash threw random stuff out just for the sake of filling time. The past few months have given me no reason to think the show might improve when it goes to 2 hours. Also, when the ratings go up after the switch, you know the station is just going to want the show back at 3 hours. Adam Moore. It's beyond me how anybody can consider Vince Russo a genius when all he's done is recycle concepts previously done in the WWF. We have several DXs. David Flair and Crowbar are Al Snow and Head. Buzzkill is Road Dogg. Lex Luger is trying to be Mr. Ass. Tank Abbott is trying to do Big Boss Man. At least I think that's what Abbott is trying to do. He certainly isn't doing Ken Shamrock. Jim Duggan is doing Mankind. I know you wrote the point of wrestling isn't to be original, but it should at least be subtle. If Russo was really clever, he'd find a way of packaging the Mexicans into a Christian and Edge versus Hardy Boys feud to get them all over, only Russo doesn't give a crap about them. But then how can he care about things like that when his main agenda seems to be getting in as many cheap digs at his old employers as possible? Another thing I found funny was the news they want X-Pac to teach Chris Jericho psychology. That was a hoot. X-Pac does the same exact match every time out. I guess it's still who you know that counts. James Hold. Houston, Texas. Response from Dave Meltzer. Actually, I think X-Pac is better when it comes to ring psychology than Jericho. I just find the whole thing amusing that suddenly Jericho, who is getting super over with the crowd, isn't a good enough worker to be a main eventer when that hardly stopped anyone in the last 15 years that was over due to a strong personality that weren't 1/10 the worker Jericho is from getting main events in the WWF. Owen Hart. I watched the A&E Owen Hart special and thought it was just great. It really touched a nerve. It was very well put together. Martha Hart came across as a very level-headed and strong person. It was just a shame that such a nice person had to be taken from the ones who loved him and that he loved so early in life. Barry St. George. Now that WWFE is a publicly traded company, do you think the McMahons' constant working of the media and others may finally catch up with them? I asked this after seeing Linda McMahon on CNBC doing damage control when asked directly about Martha Hart's lawsuit. McMahon responded as if the WWF's only concern is taking care of the Hart family financially, when in fact, the WWF had just countersued Hart days earlier. No mention of this countersuit was made. Afterwards, America Online's message board for WWFE stock was loaded with shareholders posting information regarding the lawsuit based on Mrs. McMahon's misleading comments. Paul Armentano. Hancock, Vermont. Response from Dave Meltzer. The technical countersuit was for a change of venue. I think judging from actions as opposed to words, the WWF's main concern with the Hart lawsuit is settling before it gets to court, and if that's impossible, not losing in court. You noted that the Owen Hart A&E special was the best of the week because it looked into his life outside the ring, namely his family. You also voiced your displeasure about the Steve Austin and Mick Foley ones for not doing the same. While I agree with you, it's important to remember the reason why Hart had a biography on him is because he died tragically in the ring. Austin and Foley were featured because they are superstars in the business who are still alive. If Hart was alive today, he'd not be on A&E. His special revolved around a horrible death, so as most biographical reflections show, life in retrospect is highlighted and not necessarily careers. Austin and Foley are still living, so people want the current story. Darren Chan. San Francisco, California. Response from Dave Meltzer. I had no displeasure with the Austin special. It wasn't as good as the Hart or Andre one and there were minor factual errors, but overall I thought it was good. I did with the Foley one because there was so much to his career and his life that they passed over as compared with what they spent far too much time covering. In your opinion, if it was Shane McMahon who had fallen to his death on May 23rd at the Kemper Arena, do you think Vince McMahon would have stopped the show? Chuck Langerman. Runnymede, New Jersey. Response from Dave Meltzer. I don't know McMahon well enough to give an answer to that question. As far as stopping the show, you'd think he would, but even if he hadn't, you think he wouldn't have continued his angle under those circumstances. Kaufman. Let's set the record straight. Andy Kaufman approached myself and Johnny Legend way before Jerry Lawler brought him in when I worked at the Olympic Auditorium, and Mike LaBelle, the Los Angeles promoter, didn't want him to get involved in our wrestling business. I was the one who suggested to Andy that he contact Jerry Jarrett's organization. I also contributed to Andy's My Breakfast with Blassie. I was never brought into Tennessee by Lawler, but by Tom Renisto, who was the booker at the time. I never met George Shapiro or Bob Zamuda as Kaufman plotted his wrestling career with the help of myself and Blassie at a dinner at the Pantry Restaurant in Los Angeles. Naturally, I paid for it. Jeff Walton. Los Angeles, California. Greatest wrestlers of all time. I created this list about 2 months ago for the website I write for. Since you've been discussing this on your show and I used your Hall of Fame as my primary research source, I thought you'd like to see it. You'll probably disagree with some of it, but I've been reading The Observer for 12 years and following the business for 20 and read almost everything I can get my hands on and did as good of a job as anyone most people with my background could. 1. Ric Flair, simply the greatest and most complete performer ever. 2. Lou Thesz, great wrestler and wrestling's most credible champion ever. 3. Strangler Lewis, biggest star of the 1920s and has been called the best wrestler ever. 4. Andre the Giant, wrestling's greatest worldwide attraction. 5. Frank Gotch, America's greatest historical wrestling legend. 6. Gorgeous George, made wrestling on television in the 50s. 7. Antonio Inoki, Japan's biggest star ever. 8. Hulk Hogan, big drawing card and wrestling's most marketable star. 9. Jem Londos, wrestling's biggest drawing card before television. 10. Buddy Rogers, greatest worker of the 50s and huge drawing card. 11. Terry Funk, top star for 35 years. 12. El Santo, Mexico's biggest star ever. 13. Rikidozan, father of Japanese wrestling. 14. George Hackenschmidt, popularized wrestling in Europe. Matches with Gotch popularized pro wrestling in US. 15. Ricky Steamboat, after Flair, the best worker of the 80s. Russ Kress. Union, New Jersey. Concerning wrestler of the century, Although El Santo Riquitos and Antonio Inoki were huge in their own countries, they didn't make much of an impact in most parts of the world. Hulk Hogan was something of a minor international celebrity, but he was never taken seriously as either a wrestler or a wrestling champion. He could fairly be described as the main attraction of a traveling show or a company top star and champion. Luthez was in demand internationally for many years, was viewed as a very credible wrestler and a strong world champion, and had some measure of mainstream recognition. Compared to the other four names, I think Thez should have been an easy winner. Stephen Scott. Tokyo, Japan. After reading your intentions of doing a most important wrestler of the century, I see big holes. Jim Londos blows everyone else away as a draw. Ed Lewis is the most overrated star and worker in history. You also tend to underrate Joe Stecher. Stecher was the dominant wrestler of the teen years. By all accounts, he was one of the greatest wrestlers, shooters, and hookers of all time. Luthez worked out with him in the late 30s when Stecher was living in a hospital. Even with Stecher being totally out of shape, Lou said he was a monster. A great technical wrestler in every way. Stecher's historical legend suffers when compared with Lewis. Much of this has to do with Lewis' outgoing personality and the fact he stayed in the public eye so much longer. Stecher was always quiet and stayed to himself even in his early years. His mental problems probably affected his public image. The biggest damage was done when he was unable to get world champion Frank Gotch in the ring. Stecher's title win over Charlie Cutler looks small when compared with Lewis' big title wins over Stecher. What is forgotten is Stecher's dominance of Lewis in the teens. Stecher was the superior technical shooter. In the matches that may have been shoots, Lewis ran from Stecher. Lewis had weird strength, size, stamina and balance that enabled him to beat people, but he did not have the skills of Stecher. Lewis also was afraid of Stecher. Not once did Lewis ever defend his title against Stecher. I see Stecher as the champion in their February 20, 1928 match. The stories that Stecher hid from 1925 to 128 as champion are untrue when one looks at the record. He challenged Lewis in Los Angeles and Chicago and Lewis left town. This is not meant as a put-down of Lewis. He will always be remembered with Babe Ruth and Jack Dempsey as one of the major sports figures of the 20s, but Dempsey had Gene Tunney and Lewis had Stecher. Steve Yohei. Alhambra, California. Nitro language. You remarked that Turner's excuse for the cursing on Nitro was due to no staff in the delay office. While I am involved in media and understand how things like that can happen, I thought I remembered something from the show, so I rewatched the tape. The problem with the statement is this. When they first went to the Bret Hart/Powers That Be interview, Hart was talking, and they bleeped out something he said during the early part of the conversation. 30 or 40 seconds later, the S word got out and wasn't bleeped. So how was the first one bleeped out if nobody was in the delay office? Rob Bennett. England wrestling scene. Anthony Evans, like Chris Hodgson before him, is basically accurate but still made a few errors. It needs to be understood that both TNT and Sky Sports are available only on cable/satellite, but that Sky is a subscription service, like HBO in the United States. WWF has consistently been one of Sky's highest-rated non-soccer programs, and since it probably drives subscriptions, is worth it to Sky. The UK pay-per-view shows did not draw great numbers, but they weren't expected to. The May show in London legitimately sold out in 3 hours. According to my 12-year-old godson, Miss Kitty flashing her titties at Armageddon was the hot topic in his schoolyard, though none of the kids were actually up after midnight to see it. Sky edits out most of the illegal moves, such as chair shots, from their daytime broadcasts. Channel 5 reaches about 70% of the country, so its reach is comparable to ESPN, TNT, or USA in the United States. That is not a minor league station. They have a built-in late-night sports slot which I do NFL analysis for, and it is also the UK's main slot for both Major League Baseball and the NHL. The old ITV wrestling shows, which aired on Saturday afternoons, did not average 14 million viewers. If they had, they would have been the highest-rated program on British television in those days when the early evening soap opera Coronation Street was the top draw with less than 14 million viewers. The show did draw strong enough ratings to be continued, but was killed when new ITV head Greg Dyke, who has just taken over the BBC, cancelled it because he didn't like the demographics of what Evans correctly stated was a stagnant and aging show being pushed into the shadows by the pyrotechnics of the WWF. ECW still airs here on Bravo Cable at 2:30 a.m., 30-minute show airing matches from 3 years ago. It's like watching current WWF and WCW, except the angles make more sense. What do you think of this? In 6 months, when WCW's ratings have plummeted down to the basement, Vince Russo is fired and appears back in the ring with Vince McMahon. He is then on television congratulated for the job he did. Shoot or work at that point? You decide. Michael Carlson. London, England. Drug testing. Is it an employer's responsibility to babysit their employees while they aren't on the job? No. As long as the boys outside the ring antics don't affect their job performance, it's none of the company's business. Drug testing by employers is just the top of a slippery slope. Do they have to turn in those who test positive? What drugs should be tested for? Steroids. I suppose that is a performance-enhancing drug, well, at least marketing-enhancing. What about cocaine and marijuana? Those are recreational drugs. They have nothing to do with the job. You can't claim the company encourages their use. Do we spy on the guys to make sure they aren't cheating on their wives, which is probably more prevalent than drug abuse, which is also illegal in many states? Should companies also check to make sure their wrestlers wear their seatbelts or don't cheat on their taxes? To drug test or not drug test is more complicated than what is best for business. It's more a political and philosophical issue. Being a libertarian, I believe that government and employers are not responsible for keeping up from hurting ourselves, and I know that most of the boys agree. Which makes Nash's whining about pensions, insurance and social security so amusing. But that's for another letter. Jason Campbell. Response from Dave Meltzer. By using exaggerated arguments you take away from the entire point. As long as it doesn't affect business or puts their lives at significant risk, who cares what guys do on their personal time? I agree. And when it does affect business, and that's not dollars and cents but the foundation, then it becomes an issue. Steroids totally change the business. And yes, they change the business in many other sports as well. Some sports do nothing about it. Some try to do something. Ultimately, and the difference that pro wrestling can't get around when it comes to football or baseball or any sport except pro bodybuilding, if you consider that a sport, is that pro wrestling has more overdoses and drug deaths than all of them despite having fewer full-time performers than almost all of them. Realistically, they help guys make more money and they put their health in danger in the process, and a few will die from them and probably many more later in life will suffer health complications from them. If half the guys are using steroids, most of the other half can't stand next to them and compare physically. It changes the entire complexion of the product and creates peer pressure and psychological pressure in a game where you are often judged by your body to use them. Without steroids, as we've seen, it also makes it far harder to market the product for promoters to the general public. Cocaine and marijuana probably used in small dosages have nothing to do with the job. Used in large dosages, they create an environment that is dangerous not just to the person using the drugs, which you can justify by saying it's his own problem, but also for the person working with the person, and at that point it becomes the responsibility of the promotion. There are wrestlers crippled up today from working nightly 10 years ago with superstars on cocaine that carelessly threw them around the ring because they were in no condition to work. What about when wrestlers are using drugs on the job and in the dressing room? That is not personal life. Nobody has ever suggested anything regarding seatbelts or cheating on wives, so that argument isn't even valid here. Regarding unionization, I've talked to few wrestlers who aren't in favor of it and even fewer who think it has much of a chance to the nature of the industry of happening anytime soon. Sakuraba Gracie. Just got the new issue of The Observer and enjoyed it, but there were a few things I wanted to point out to you for future reference. You said the Kimura, the V1 arm lock, the double wrist lock and the chicken wing were all the same hold. This isn't correct. The V1 arm lock was a term created by Satoru Sayama to describe the top wrist lock, also known as the key lock. The Kimura is very close to being the double wrist lock used by the old-timers, but the jiu-jitsu people control from the wrist instead of from the hand. They also don't use the thumb. The chicken wing can only be done when a guy is on his face and you are on top. As for breaking an arm with the Kimura, it can't be done. You can tear tendons and ligaments of the arm and or the shoulder, but you can't break the arm. The only way I've seen bones get broken in combat is through strikes and or falls. Matt Fury. Tampa, Florida. Response from Dave Meltzer. Fury is a former collegiate wrestling champ, who once beat Scott Steiner when both were in college wrestling, and martial arts world champion who trains under Carl Gotch and does a newsletter called Gain on Combat Wrestling. McMahon. I just got done reading the December 20th readers' pages, and after reading all the negative things written about Vince McMahon, I have these thoughts. Everyone is a hypocrite. I don't care who you are, where you've been or what you've experienced. Everybody at one point or another has used bad language and expressed things in a sexual nature and so many other things that McMahon is being blasted for using in his storylines and angles. The key words are storylines and angles. While the in-ring wrestling is fake from being fake, as some would say, everything else in wrestling is. Sure, at times they've used things that have happened to a wrestler in real life and turned it into an angle, but it was designed that way and there is nothing wrong with that. Complaining that wrestling today is not suitable for children is a valid point. But it's not Vince McMahon's job, nor the job of any other wrestler, to raise anyone's kids. If a parent or parents don't have the time to monitor what their kids watch, they shouldn't have had kids. Period. When I was a kid, I wasn't even allowed to stay up past 8 p.m. until I was 12. I couldn't stay up until 10 p.m. until I was 16. I watched wrestling, but my parents were very clear about what it was. As for the language and sexual content or even the violence, get over it. People simply want to tell others what to do and then do the exact opposite because it makes them feel like bigger people. I'm not going to say I like everything on wrestling today, and I'm not just talking about WWF. But they have as much right to do what they do as a preacher has to do what he does. Matt Alma. Las Vegas, Nevada. ECW. Do you think ECW being on the Nashville network affects its ratings? I know TNN is available in 75 million homes, but to many, TNN is still hillbilly TV while TNT, TBS and USA are considered full-service networks. Would Raw's War draw ratings on Lifetime? And what about the fact that ECW is on Friday nights at 8 p.m. if their target audience is teenagers? Most teens aren't home Friday nights at 8 p.m. Most are playing or watching football. No one would admit to watching TV on a Friday night at 8 p.m. I think they might draw better at a later time, like 11 p.m. or even midnight, when it would be considered cool to watch it. Maybe even cult-like. They will never draw Raw-like numbers because more people watch TV on Mondays than Fridays. That's why the networks usually throw in the towel at night as far as programming. I also agree that ECW has misused its time. We need more Rob Van Dam and the Impact players and more of Mike Awesome. He's the champ and needs to be pushed as such. The Sandman angle was great. Now they need to build on it. For better or worse, fans now expect angles on their TV shows and ECW needs more drama to complement its wrestling. As far as the new WCW regime, time will tell. But it smacks of hypocrisy for a company to complain about their competition and the methods they use, and then hire those responsible for those methods they despise publicly. Do standards and practices enforce all TNT programs or just Nitro? Many movies and shows on TNT have far worse language than screwed as normal dialogue. Nitro is at least interesting again, but if they become Raw, who will watch them? Most of the fans who watch Raw watch because Nitro had gotten so bad, not because Raw had gotten so good. For all the criticism WCW got for mistreating their future stars, look at Chris Jericho and Paul White. Jericho is the most misused wrestler in the world right now. And it isn't because anyone is holding him back. He's just being misused. Raw is getting stale because it's the same thing over and over, and you can only shock people for so long before the shock wears thin, and the wrestling remains. And now they've conditioned people not to care about what goes on in the ring. What is left for them to do? Paul Nucci. Port Austin, Michigan. Response from Dave Meltzer. ECW being on TNN does affect its ratings. But WWF being on UPN, the lowest rated network, should affect its ratings, but after a month on the air they've steadily built their audience to being competitive with everything but NBC. Raw wouldn't draw quite as high ratings on Lifetime as it does on USA, but would still draw monster ratings for Lifetime if it switched tomorrow. Regarding Friday versus Monday, approximately 60% of the homes with TV sets are watching on Fridays from 8 and 9 p.m. when ECW is on. Approximately 68% of the homes with TV sets are watching between 9 and 11 p.m. on Mondays when Raw and Nitro are on. But a lot of that is because the quality of shows is better on Monday plus the football game is on. In the case of ECW, the difference in the number of people watching television on Monday as compared with Friday would be statistically equivalent to the difference between a 0.90 and a 1.02 rating, and ECW isn't battling another wrestling show head-to-head as Raw and Nitro are. Forever ECW is ragged on from one source or another, even though I admit their TV product based around Tanda, the pay-per-view product has been the most consistent out of the US promotions this year. If you were to analyze all the pay-per-view shows in 1999, you'd find that ECW has the best in-ring product and has more better matches. WWF had the tag team ladder match, but that's it. WCW had a good card for Spring Stampede, but then that's it. ECW had the best pay-per-view shows this year, Anarchy Rules, and the others have been more good ones than bad. Stuart Rogers. Birmingham, England. Ross parody. Let me add my discomfort with the Oklahoma character. Granted, the parody of Jim Ross announcing style made me laugh, but the distaste of mocking his Bell's palsy condition, and indirectly its causes, It's more of a low blow than anything China ever delivered. Jim Ross is the best wrestling announcer on American television. He got his own patented cliches, but nothing is as obtrusive as lame, out-of-date jokes and not acknowledging the action in the ring. Even the best can be parodied, but they shouldn't be ridiculed for a medical condition beyond their control. Rich Kaz. Chicago, Illinois. Dynamite Kid. Finished reading Pure Dynamite and thought the book was excellent. His thoughts about the other wrestlers, the pranks and the drug use was fascinating. I thought it was kind of weird the way the book changed from shoot to work when Dynamite described some of the wrestling as real. The situation described with Bret Hart versus Abdullah the Butcher always stood out in my mind. The wrestler Dynamite forget was Jerry Morrow, and the angle was really brought to life with Bret getting involved as he was returning from knee surgery and risking everything to stop the crazed Butcher. I've been really lucky to have lived in Western Canada and have seen a lot of Dynamite's matches live, on Stampede TV or on videotapes from Japan. The book brought back so many great memories and even enhanced them with the behind-the-scenes info. I hope the book enabled him to relive the thrills, not that his body is no longer able. The worst world title match ever on Raw was Big Show versus Davey Boy. How pathetic. A big foot that missed and a choke slam that was garbage. Grant Swarich. Peterborough, Ontario. I gave the book a slight thumbs down. I thought Tom Billington went on a little too much about Davey Boy Smith and about all the ribs he pulled. I was looking for more insight into Billington the man. Sadly, we didn't get it. While I thought he provided a great insight into life on the road in the WWF during the 80s, the book came off as pretty bitter. I was also confused as to why he chose to write about his career in Japan as if the matches were real. I wrote a review knowing that we had Billington scheduled for an interview the following week. I told my editor that I didn't like the book and that we might want to hold off running the review in case he were to see it and pull out. My editor didn't think it was necessary. But that's exactly what he did. The ghostwriter who helped him with the book informed us he would not be able to grant us an interview, citing the fact there were several inaccuracies in my review. When asked what those inaccuracies were, she said, "If you read the book, you'd know what they are." Real helpful. Then he posted a message on his site combating our criticism of the book, stating he didn't have a media outlet to tell his side. Never mind that we were giving him just that outlet to speak with us. I think it became clear from their attitudes that they pulled out because they just didn't like my negative review, not because of any supposed inaccuracies. What a great business wrestling is. John Molinaro. Burlington, Ontario. Jeff Hardy. Seeing the tag team cage match on Raw between the Hardys and Christian and Edge just emphasized to me how much I miss the time when wrestling was about wrestling. In 10 years, Jeff Hardy is going to be like the Dynamite Kid, all for 5-minute matches filled with crazy spots that nobody remembers 10 minutes after they're over, done for a promoter who couldn't give a damn if his wrestlers live or die, as long as they don't do it on his watch. D.L. Burrell. I thought your show the other day had some interesting comments about Jeff Hardy. Having been Jeff's friend for the past 4 years, I can say the following things about him. He has never done drugs, recreational or anabolic. He doesn't drink. He doesn't party like so many of the boys do. He takes great care of his body. The WWF schedule is incredibly tough. I'll admit that I'm worried that little injuries will accumulate. They aren't getting sufficient rest. But you also need to understand Jeff's body. Although they are working more now than when they were working indies, they're doing substantially shorter matches and are doing far fewer high spots. A typical Hardy match in Omega was 15 and 25 minutes of constant high spots. And these were mainly singles matches. Jeff's body has amazing flexibility. I've seen him do spots far more dangerous than what he does on television. He does take risks, but he knows what he's doing. He was doing this kind of stuff in front of small indie crowds because he loves it. Matt and Jeff are two of the most dedicated wrestlers I've ever known, and yeah, I'm biased. They'll go the extra mile to do a good job. They are very mindful of where they are and from whence they came. God forbid if something happens and Jeff has to retire at 30 or sooner, and I can promise you if he does, he won't be penniless. But I'm hedging my bets he'll be around for a long time. Thomas Simpson. Whether it's the clash of titans in the ring or the drama that unfolds outside it, we're here to break it down, match by match, feud by feud. Remember, in the world of wrestling, every day is a battle, and every victory is a story waiting to be told. Until next time, keep the passion alive, and never stop wrestling with the possibilities. This is the Pro Wrestle Machine.